In late October of 2021, a married couple in their early 30s, Ethan and Maya Caldwell, closed on an idyllic two-story Tudor-style rental home in the quiet, wooded suburbs of Lake Forest, Illinois. Ethan was an independent risk analyst for an insurance firm in Chicago, while Maya worked remotely as a botanical illustrator for regional academic journals. With the birth of their first child expected in the coming spring, they were desperate to trade their congested urban loft for space, tranquility, and a large yard. The house sat at the dead end of a winding residential lane lined with towering black walnut trees and dense thickets of buckthorn. Built in the late 1930s, the structure possessed magnificent leaded glass casement windows, original dark oak timbering, and a steep gabled roofline that looked straight out of a classic architectural magazine. The landlord, an elderly real estate investor who spent his winters in Florida, had offered the lease at a substantial discount, citing the older boiler heating system and the minor maintenance requirements typical of historic Midwestern homes. For the first few weeks, the Caldwells felt an overwhelming sense of domestic peace. The house was drafty, but Ethan kept the brick fireplace roaring in the living room every evening. Upstairs, they set up their master bedroom, an open-concept art studio for Maya, and a nursery that Ethan was actively painting in warm, pale yellow tones. The air throughout the house smelled of beeswax polish, dry oak lath, and wood ash, a nostalgic, comforting scent that made the property feel safe. However, as November arrived and the first bitter sleet storms swept across Lake Michigan, an irritating disturbance surfaced along the second-floor ceiling. It began on the night of November 12th, around 1:15 in the morning. Ethan was lying awake in bed, reading financial reports on his tablet, when a faint, dry sound emerged from the ceiling corner directly above Maya's side of the bed. It was a light, erratic scratching, accompanied by the muffled scuttle of tiny claws moving across dry plaster. Ethan nudged Maya awake, but by the time she opened her eyes, the sound had faded into the silence of the night. Ethan smiled, reassuring his wife that the cold weather was simply driving field mice or black roof rats into the eaves of the attic to nest near the warm chimney stack. Having grown up in rural Wisconsin, Ethan was well acquainted with the seasonal habits of woodland rodents. The next morning, Ethan drove down to the local hardware store on Western Avenue and purchased half a dozen heavy-duty snap traps, several boxes of rodent bait blocks, and 2 cans of expanding polyurethane foam. He pulled down the attic access ladder located in the hallway closet, poked his head into the dark, dusty crawl space, and scattered the baited traps across the exposed fiberglass insulation, making sure to seal a few small gaps along the exterior soffits. For 3 days, the scratching stopped completely, and Ethan congratulated himself on solving the problem quickly. Then, on the freezing night of November 19th, the scratching returned with an unsettling intensity. Around 2:30 in the morning, Maya sat bolt upright in bed, gasping as a loud, rhythmic, rasping sound echoed directly behind the drywall of the nursery next door. It did not sound like the frantic, light skittering of a quarter-pound field mouse. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate, sounding like a blunt nail or a thick wire being dragged rhythmically along the wooden lath strips. Ethan got out of bed, grabbed a heavy metal flashlight, and walked into the unfinished nursery. He pressed his ear flat against the yellow plaster wall. Beneath the paint, he could distinctly hear something moving inside the partition cavity. But what chilled Ethan was the cadence. The scratching would scrape 5 times, pause for exactly 3 seconds, and then scrape 5 times again, repeating with mechanical, almost rhythmic precision. Ethan tapped hard on the drywall with his knuckles to scare whatever creature was inside. The moment his knuckles struck the plaster, the wall tapped back. 3 sharp, heavy raps from inside the hollow cavity, directly level with Ethan's chest. Ethan stepped backward, his heart leaping into his throat. He tried to convince himself that a trapped raccoon or a large opossum had crawled down from the attic and was simply reacting in defense against the wall framing. The following afternoon, Ethan called a local licensed wildlife removal specialist named Carl Hatcher to conduct a comprehensive structural sweep of the attic, chimney, and perimeter foundations. Carl was a veteran exterminator with 30 years of experience handling animal intrusions across the North Shore. He arrived in a white utility van, strapped on heavy leather gloves, grabbed an industrial inspection borescope camera, and spent nearly 3 hours scouring the property from top to bottom. When Carl climbed down from the hallway ceiling hatch, he pulled off his dust mask and looked at Ethan with an expression of complete professional bewilderment. Carl explained that there was not a single trace of rodent or raccoon activity anywhere in the attic. There were no droppings, no shredded insulation nests, no chewed electrical wiring, and every single snap trap Ethan had laid out was still fully set with the bait completely untouched. Furthermore, the borescope camera showed that all exterior chimney flashing and roof vents were completely sealed with heavy galvanized wire mesh, making it physically impossible for any wild animal larger than an insect to penetrate the roofline. Carl packed his gear, shook his head, and suggested that perhaps the old cast iron steam pipes inside the radiator system were expanding and contracting against the wooden floor joists as the boiler cycled on and off, creating a scraping resonance that mimicked animal movement. Ethan desperately wanted to believe the steam pipe theory. But over the following 2 weeks, from late November into early December 2021, the atmosphere inside the Lake Forest house deteriorated into pure psychological dread. Small, unsettling occurrences began to manifest around the living quarters. Maya would find the kitchen pantry door unlatched and standing slightly ajar in the mornings, despite having secured it the night before. A small silver baby rattle, a gift from Maya's mother sitting on the nursery dresser, vanished without a trace, only to turn up 3 days later, sitting upright on the bottom step of the basement stairs. Maya became convinced that the house was afflicted by something unnatural. She began suffering from severe insomnia, terrified of the oppressive, heavy silence that settled over the second floor whenever Ethan was downstairs. She repeatedly told Ethan that whenever she sat in the nursery painting her botanical studies during the afternoon, she could feel a cold, faint draft brushing across her ankles, accompanied by the distinct, sickening smell of wet, sour wool and old copper. The climax of the terror occurred on the stormy night of the 14th of December 2021. A violent winter blizzard swept across Lake County, bringing sustained gale force winds, blinding snowfall, and freezing rain that snapped tree branches and knocked out municipal power across the entire neighborhood around 10 in the evening. The house plunged into pitch blackness, the radiators groaning as the electric boiler shut down, causing the interior temperature to plummet rapidly into the high 40s. Ethan lit several thick candles, placed them in ceramic bowls around the master bedroom, and urged Maya to bundle under several heavy down comforters to stay warm. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan was awoken by a sound that made every hair on his arms stand on end. It was not the wind howling against the gables. It was that same dry, abrasive scratching sound. But this time, it was not muffled behind lath and plaster. It was completely open, loud, and immediate, originating from directly beneath their heavy wooden bed frame. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause, scratch, scratch, scratch. Ethan lay entirely frozen under the blankets, his eyes wide in the dim, flickering orange candlelight. Maya was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and rhythmic. Ethan slowly slid his hand toward the edge of the mattress, reaching down to where his heavy tactical flashlight sat on the nightstand. His fingers curled around the knurled metal barrel. He clicked the tail switch, sending a blinding white LED beam cutting across the dark bedroom. Ethan took a deep, silent breath, rolled toward the edge of the mattress, and lowered the flashlight over the side, shining the high-powered beam directly into the dark void beneath the bed frame. The space beneath the bed was empty. There were only 2 plastic underbed storage bins and a pair of Maya's fleece slippers. Ethan let out a long, trembling breath of relief, resting his forehead against the wooden bedrail. Then, right at the edge of his peripheral vision, something caught his eye against the dark oak floorboards. In the center of the hardwood floor directly beneath the bed, the antique floral area rug had been shifted back by several inches, exposing a section of bare floorboards that Ethan had never seen before. Set flush into the oak planks was an old, rectangular cold air return iron vent grate, measuring roughly 12 inches wide by 24 inches long. The 4 heavy, flathead steel screws that secured the cast iron decorative grate to the floor framing had been cleanly extracted, sitting neatly in a small, organized row on the polished wood beside the opening. And resting right inside the dark galvanized ductwork shaft directly beneath the removed grate was a small, familiar silver object glinting in the LED light, the missing baby rattle. Ethan felt a surge of pure adrenaline freeze his blood. He leaned down lower, pointing the flashlight directly down into the vertical cold air return duct that dropped straight through the interior wall cavity toward the basement furnace trunk lines below. The beam of light traveled down the metal shaft, illuminating a series of small, custom-welded steel climbing rungs that had been anchored directly into the sheet metal walls of the ductwork at 12-inch intervals. And looking up from the dark bend of the duct shaft, 15 feet down inside the central heating core of the house, Ethan saw a pair of human hands, pale, heavily calloused, with fingernails worn down to raw, ragged edges gripping the metal rungs, accompanied by the slow, raspy sound of human breath echoing upward through the vents. Ethan did not scream. He did not freeze. The primal urge to protect his pregnant wife and unborn child took over his entire body in a fraction of a second. Ethan dropped the flashlight onto the rug, grabbed the heavy, solid oak nightstand with both hands, and flipped the 100-pound piece of furniture upside down directly over the open duct vent, slamming the heavy timber down against the iron framing with a concussive crash. From inside the duct shaft, directly beneath the oak wood, a frantic, muffled scraping erupted, followed by 2 violent, concussive thuds against the underside of the floorboards as whoever was climbing the metal rungs slammed their fists upward against the barricade. Ethan leaped onto the bed, shook Maya violently awake, and yelled at her to get up immediately. Maya opened her eyes in a terrified panic, seeing the sheer, wild terror on her husband's face. Ethan grabbed her winter coat, threw it over her shoulders, dragged her out of the master bedroom, and bolted down the dark second-floor hallway. They took the stairs, 3 at a time, burst out through the front entryway into the freezing blizzard, and ran straight across the knee-deep snow toward Ethan's all-wheel drive SUV parked in the driveway. Ethan slammed Maya into the passenger seat, jumped behind the wheel, locked all 4 doors, and hit the ignition. He threw the transmission into reverse, spun the tires through the heavy slush, and tore down the residential lane onto Western Avenue, screaming into his phone as he dialed 911. Within 12 minutes, 5 squad cars from the Lake Forest Police Department and the Lake County Sheriff Department arrived at the dead-end lane, surrounding the Tudor residence with high-powered searchlights and weapons drawn. Tactical officers breached the front door, sweeping through the dark ground floor before advancing upstairs to secure the master bedroom. The overturned nightstand remained firmly in place over the open-air vent, but the sounds from beneath had stopped entirely. Officers moved the nightstand and lowered a fiber-optic tactical camera down into the galvanized return shaft. The duct was empty, but the custom-welded steel climbing rungs extended all the way down through the core of the house, leading directly into the main mechanical plenum above the decommissioned 1930s coal furnace in the deepest section of the stone basement. Tactical teams descended into the basement, clearing through rows of old timber framing and disused coal bins. Inside the cavernous, hollow sheet metal interior of the old industrial heating furnace, officers uncovered a fully functional, insulated living habitat. The interior of the vintage furnace had been lined with layers of acoustic foam and wool blankets, Inside was a sleeping cot, an unlit propane camping heater, dozens of opened ration cans, a pair of night vision binoculars, and a battery-powered shortwave scanner tuned directly to the local emergency police frequencies. Pinned to the metal walls of the furnace were dozens of detailed, hand-drawn blueprints of the house's entire internal structural cavities, along with handwritten observation charts detailing Ethan and Maya's daily schedules, their sleep cycles, and the projected due date of their baby. An exterior basement coal chute window was found kicked open from the inside, leading out into the dark woods behind the property. K9 tracking teams swept through the snow-covered buckthorn thickets, tracking a fresh scent trail through the blizzard to a detached private carriage house 3 doors down the lane. There, hiding in the unheated loft above a private garage, police arrested 42-year-old Warren Gable. When investigators ran Gable's fingerprints and history through regional databases, the terrifying, unbelievable truth of the Lake Forest house came into full focus. Warren Gable was the estranged adult son of the elderly property owner who spent his winters in Florida. Warren was a licensed HVAC technician and metal fabricator who had lived in the house as a child. When his father began leasing out the property to rotating tenants years prior, Warren refused to let go of the family estate. Using his professional knowledge of structural heating systems, Warren had systematically modified the massive, disused gravity-fed heating trunk lines during a previous vacancy, welding internal ladders, and carving access panels behind baseboard grates to turn the entire interior wall network into a private, hidden transit system. He did not live in the house full-time. He used his father's spare keys to slip into the basement during the winter months, living inside the furnace and moving through the ductwork while tenants slept above him. The scratching sounds that had terrorized Ethan and Maya for weeks had not been rats, mice, or expanding steam pipes. They were the sounds of Warren Gable slowly and methodically unscrewing the ventilation grates from the inside using a small flathead pocket tool, testing how far he could extend his upper body into the living quarters without alerting the residents. The rhythmic tapping Ethan had heard in the nursery had been Warren tapping his tool against the tin duct to measure the sound resonance of the empty room. Warren Gable was charged and convicted in Lake County Circuit Court on multiple felony counts of home invasion, stalking, residential burglary, and criminal trespass, receiving a 20-year sentence in state prison. Ethan and Maya broke their lease immediately, moved into a modern, single-story ranch home in southern Wisconsin, and welcomed a healthy baby girl the following spring. Ethan had every single heating vent in their new home inspected, reinforced, and bolted with tamper-proof security steel, knowing firsthand that the terrifying sounds in the walls are sometimes not animals at all, but a human being watching you from the dark. In summer of 2021, a young married couple, Brian and Elena Whitmore, along with their 7-year-old son, Lucas, decided it was time to leave their cramped suburban townhouse in Columbus, Ohio. Brian was a structural design technician who had recently transitioned into full-time remote consulting, and Elena worked as an online curriculum developer for high school science programs. Because both of their careers were now fully digital, they no longer needed to endure the daily highway commute or the crowded neighborhoods of the city. They wanted space, fresh air, and a place with historic character where Lucas could grow up exploring a large backyard. After months of browsing real estate listings across the state, they came across a striking property in rural Knox County, just outside the quiet town of Mount Vernon. It was a sprawling, 2-story farmhouse built in the late 1920s, resting on a gentle grassy hill surrounded by 5 acres of rolling pasture and thick walnut trees. The house had high ceilings, heavy oak doors, a wide wraparound porch, and a deep stone cellar that stayed naturally cool even during the peak of summer humidity. The previous owner, a retired dairy farmer, had passed away nearly 2 years earlier, leaving the estate to distant relatives who were eager to sell quickly at an attractive price. Brian and Elena toured the property in early July, fell in love with its timeless aesthetic, and closed on the sale by the middle of August. Moving day was hot and exhausting, but as the Whitmore family unpacked their boxes and arranged their furniture across the hardwood floors, they felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. They believed they had found their permanent sanctuary. However, almost immediately after settling in, subtle and deeply peculiar things began to occur throughout the house. The initial anomalies started in late September 2021 when the autumn temperatures began to drop and the nights grew noticeably longer. Elena was the first to notice something out of the ordinary. She would come down to the kitchen in the early morning to prepare breakfast for Lucas, only to find several of the upper cabinet doors standing completely wide open. At first, she simply assumed that Brian had gone downstairs for a midnight glass of water and neglected to close them properly. But when she asked him about it over coffee, Brian looked confused, insisting that he had slept through the night and had not set foot in the kitchen since dinner. A week later, the disturbances escalated. Lucas began waking up between 2 and 3 in the morning, complaining of what he described as heavy scratching sounds coming from inside the drywall right beside his bed. Brian, being practical and experienced with older structures, assumed that a family of field mice, raccoons, or squirrels had found an entry point through the exterior cedar siding as the weather turned cold. He climbed a ladder outside, inspected the eaves, patched a few small gaps along the roofline, and placed several humane traps in the basement and along the crawlspaces. Yet, the traps remained completely empty for weeks, and the scratching noises persisted, growing louder and shifting from room to room with an unnerving irregularity. By November, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse took a distinctly ominous turn. The entire family began to experience an overwhelming sensation of heavy air, accompanied by an intense feeling of being watched whenever they were alone in certain sections of the house. Elena would be sitting at the dining room table working on her laptop in the middle of the afternoon, only to feel a sudden, freezing draft brush pass the back of her neck, despite all the double-hung windows being firmly locked and sealed. Whenever she turned around, expecting to see Brian or Lucas walking into the room, the hallway would be entirely empty, bathed in dead silence. Then came the physical disturbances that became impossible to rationalize through drafty windows or settling timbers. One Saturday evening in early December, while the family was sitting together in the living room watching a movie, a heavy ceramic vase sitting squarely on the fireplace mantel suddenly tipped forward and crashed onto the brick hearth, shattering into dozens of sharp fragments. Neither Brian, Elena, nor Lucas was within 10 feet of the mantel. Brian immediately stood up and examined the wooden shelf, checking with a level to see if the brickwork had shifted, but the wood was perfectly flat and secure. There had been no truck passing on the gravel road outside, and no physical vibration had traveled through the floorboards. A few nights later, Elena woke up around 3:30 in the morning to the distinct metallic sound of the heavy front door deadbolt clicking open, followed by the slow groan of the front door swinging outward on its brass hinges. Elena nudged Brian awake, her voice trembling in the dark. Brian grabbed a solid wooden baseball bat from the closet and crept down the stairs, every nerve on high alert, expecting to confront an intruder. When he reached the ground floor, he found the heavy front door wide open, allowing freezing winter wind and blowing snow to drift directly onto the entryway rug. The outside temperature was 22 degrees. Brian quickly searched the entire downstairs with a flashlight, checked the locks on all the windows, and stepped out onto the front porch to inspect the freshly fallen snow. To his utter bewilderment, there were no footprints in the snow on the porch steps, no tire tracks in the driveway, and no sign of forced entry anywhere on the frame. The deadbolt had simply been turned from the inside. Over the next 2 months, from January through February of 2022, life inside the Knox County farmhouse became an absolute psychological nightmare for the Whitmores. The incidents grew relentlessly frequent and increasingly aggressive. Objects would vanish from countertops and turn up days later, placed neatly on the basement stairs or hidden behind the living room sofa. Lucas refused to sleep in his bedroom, weeping in terror because he claimed he could hear a low, wet breathing sound coming from the small vintage air intake vent near the baseboard of his closet. Elena, who had always been deeply rational and skeptical of the paranormal, began to search local library archives and historic records online, looking into the history of the property to see if any tragedies, violent crimes, or untimely deaths had occurred on the land over the past century. She genuinely believed that the house was afflicted by some form of restless spirit or paranormal entity. The sheer impossibility of the physical events, doors unlocking themselves, objects shifting positions without human contact, and the cold drafts that seemed to follow them from room to room left her with no other logical framework. Brian, though desperately trying to remain the calm pillar of the household, was losing his own grip on composure. He installed battery-powered digital security cameras in the living room and the kitchen to capture evidence of what was happening. Yet, every time a bizarre occurrence took place, the cameras either suffered sudden, unexplained battery drains, or their recording lenses were found tilted upward toward the ceiling, as though someone had deliberately pushed them out of alignment while the family slept. The breaking point arrived on the stormy night of the 19th of March, 2022. A severe spring thunderstorm rolled across Knox County, bringing torrential rain, high winds, and heavy lightning strikes that knocked out the main electrical transformer down the road, plunging the entire area into complete darkness around 9 in the evening. Brian lit several candles and placed them around the kitchen and living room, while Elena sat with Lucas on the sofa, trying to keep the frightened boy calm as thunder rattled the window panes. Around midnight, exhausted from the tension and the oppressive dark, the family decided to go up to bed together in the primary bedroom, keeping the door locked and a candle burning on the nightstand. At approximately 2:45 in the morning, Brian was awakened by a strange, continuous sound that cut through the sound of the rain outside. It was not the wind, and it was not settling wood. It was the faint, rhythmic sound of running water coming from the ground floor. Brian sat up in bed, reached for his heavy metalwork flashlight, and quietly unlocked the bedroom door. He told Elena to stay in bed with Lucas and keep the door locked behind him. He stepped out into the dark upper hallway, switched on the flashlight, and began walking down the wooden staircase, each step creaking softly under his socks. The air in the stairwell felt unusually heavy, thick with moisture, and an odd, sour smell that smelled faintly like wet copper and unwashed fabric. Brian reached the bottom of the stairs and moved slowly into the kitchen. The flashlight beam revealed that the chrome faucet over the large ceramic sink was turned on full blast, sending a heavy stream of water splashing against the drain. Brian stepped forward and firmly turned off the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. He stood completely still in the dark kitchen, listening intently. That was when he heard a quiet, metallic click directly behind him, coming from the far corner of the kitchen where the old stone cellar door was located. Brian slowly turned the beam of his flashlight toward the corner. The cellar door, which had a heavy brass sliding bolt on the kitchen side that Brian had personally locked before going to bed, was unlatched. The heavy wooden door stood open by roughly 3 inches, revealing a pitch-black gap leading down into the stone basement below. Brian approached the opening slowly, raising his flashlight high to illuminate the wooden stairs leading downward. The air coming up from the basement was frigid, carrying a sharp draft that made his skin prickle. He took a step down onto the first basement tread, then the second, his eyes scanning the stone foundation walls, the vintage cast-iron furnace, and the rows of empty wooden fruit shelves. Everything appeared still. He reached the dirt and stone floor of the basement and swung the light toward the far back wall, near the crawlspace access that led beneath the rear addition of the house. There, tucked away behind an old stack of vintage storm windows, Brian noticed something he had never seen before. A large sheet of decorative wood paneling, which appeared firmly nailed to the foundation wall, was slightly misaligned, sitting a few inches away from the stone mortar. Brian walked over to the paneling and pulled it back with his left hand, shining the flashlight directly into the hidden recess behind it. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a tight, excavated cavity carved deep beneath the structural foundation of the house. Inside the hidden enclosure sat a sleeping bag, several empty food cans with brand names purchased from the local Mount Vernon grocery store within the past 2 weeks, a pair of worn sneakers, a battery-operated radio with the power light glowing faint amber, and an open spiral notebook containing detailed, handwritten timelines tracking every single hour of the Whitmore family's daily schedule. And just beyond the edge of the sleeping bag, disappearing into a narrow crawl space that ran directly between the floor joists of the living room above, Brian saw a pair of wide, unblinking human eyes staring directly back into the light. For a fraction of a second, Brian could not process what he was looking at. His brain desperately tried to fit those wide, bloodshot eyes into a rational category, an animal, a reflection on glass, an illusion created by the shadows and his own sleep-deprived mind. Then, the eyes blinked. A sharp, violent rasp of breath cut through the silence of the crawlspace, and the figure suddenly shifted backward, retreating deeper into the narrow gap between the heavy timber floor joists. The spell of paralysis broke instantly. Pure, primal adrenaline surged through Brian's body. He did not yell down into the void. He did not attempt to negotiate. He backed away from the false wall as fast as his feet could carry him, scrambled up the wooden basement stairs 2 at a time, slammed the heavy cellar door shut, and threw the brass sliding latch with all the force in his arms. He bolted up the main staircase to the 2nd floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He pushed into the primary bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it behind him. Elena was already sitting up in bed, clutching Lucas tightly against her chest, her eyes wide with fear as she saw the sheer terror written across her husband's face. Brian pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands, dialed 911, and kept his voice to a harsh, urgent whisper, telling the Knox County emergency dispatcher that there was an active intruder living inside the structural walls and basement of their home, and that his family was currently barricaded in the upstairs bedroom. For 20 agonizing minutes, the Whitmores sat huddled in absolute darkness, listening. Through the wooden floorboards beneath their bed, they could hear the unmistakable, calculated sounds of movement inside the crawlspace walls, slow, deliberate scuffling, the muffled rustle of clothing against wood, and the faint creak of ceiling laths directly below the hallway. The entity they had spent 7 months believing to be a ghost, a demon, or a restless spirit was right there beneath their feet, navigating the hollow cavities of the house like a rodent in a maze. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 Knox County Sheriff Patrol cruisers swept across the bedroom ceiling through the rain-streaked windows. 4 armed deputies entered the farmhouse through the front door, clearing the ground floor before coming upstairs to escort Brian, Elena, and Lucas safely out to a waiting vehicle in the driveway. With the family secured, deputies descended into the stone cellar with flashlights and service weapons drawn. Behind the false wood paneling, they uncovered an extensive, concealed, subterranean living system that had been modified with disturbing ingenuity. The individual had dug out additional soil to create clearance beneath the foundation, tapped directly into the home's primary electrical junction box to run low-voltage charging cables and a small space heater, and used the old gravity-fed heating duct system as both an acoustic listening network and a physical pathway to access the voids between the walls. Small, neatly cut viewports, no larger than the head of a nail, were discovered drilled through the baseboards and closet walls of nearly every room, including Lucas's bedroom and the primary bath, allowing the intruder to monitor the family's every movement without ever being seen. The unexplained open cabinets, the moved items, the unlocked doors, and the shattered vase on the hearth had not been supernatural poltergeist activity at all. They were the deliberate actions of a man slipping in and out of the living space in the dead of night while the family slept, taking food, observing their private routines, and systematically tilting the security cameras to cover his tracks. Deputies followed the crawl space to a narrow exterior ventilation shaft on the east side of the foundation, where the metal grate had been carefully unbolted from the inside. Roughly 45 minutes later, K9 units tracked a scent trail through the dense woods behind the property, discovering 52-year-old Arthur Pendleton hiding inside a dilapidated hunting blind a quarter of a mile into the tree line, shivering in soaked clothing. When investigators ran his background, the final, chilling truth of the situation came to light. Arthur was not an escaped convict or a random drifter. He was the estranged, disinherited younger brother of the deceased dairy farmer who had previously owned the property. When the estate was sold off by distant relatives following his brother's death, Arthur felt entirely cheated out of what he believed was his rightful ancestral home. He had moved into the crawl spaces and foundation cavities weeks before the house was ever put on the market in 2021. He had lived completely undetected underneath the floorboards for nearly 9 continuous months, watching the Whitmore family move in, unpack their lives, raise their son, and slowly descend into psychological torment. His ultimate goal, as detailed in the extensive notes recovered from his underground bunker, had not been an immediate violent attack. He had deliberately staged the phantom phenomena to make the family believe the farmhouse was violently haunted, hoping to drive them insane with fear until they broke their lease, abandoned the property, and left him alone in the only home he had ever known. Brian and Elena packed their essential belongings that very morning under police escort, checked into a hotel in Columbus, and never spent another night inside the house. Within 2 months, the property was sold at a massive loss, a stark and permanent reminder that the most terrifying monsters in the dark are never ghosts, but the very real, flesh and blood people hiding just inches behind the wall. In late September of 2022, a 33-year-old architectural photographer named Julian Mercer purchased what he believed was the renovation opportunity of a lifetime. Julian had spent over a decade living in a cramped rental unit in downtown Chicago, shooting commercial real estate and historic buildings across the Midwest. He possessed a sharp eye for classic carpentry, masonry, and hidden structural potential. For years, he had saved nearly every dollar he earned, waiting for the right moment to buy an older property with genuine historical value that he could restore with his own hands. He eventually found a listing for an isolated, 2-story Victorian colonial house located on the rural outskirts of Galena, Illinois. The house was constructed in 1894, resting quietly at the end of an overgrown gravel lane bordered by old limestone bluffs and dense stands of bur oak trees. It had sat vacant and neglected for nearly 16 months after the estate of its previous owner, a reclusive former municipal archivist named Walter Halloway, was quietly settled through a county probate auction. The purchase price was remarkably low for a home with original pocket doors, carved walnut mantels, and intact leaded glass windows. When Julian toured the property alongside a local real estate representative on a brisk autumn afternoon, the house smelled heavily of damp plaster, oxidized wallpaper paste, and cold pine boards. Yet, structurally, the stone foundation was level, the roof rafters were solid, and the property offered absolute seclusion. Julian finalized the purchase on October 6th, packed his camera equipment and carpentry tools into an enclosed utility trailer, and moved in just as the autumn foliage began turning deep crimson across Joe Daviess County. During the first month, Julian worked relentlessly from dawn until well after midnight. He systematically cleared out decades of water-damaged wallpaper, sanded back layers of discolored polyurethane from the ground floor oak floors, and set up a temporary living quarter in the smaller front bedroom on the second floor. The house was drafty, and the autumn winds whistling through the limestone bluffs often produced low, hollow moans across the exterior cedar siding. But Julian was thoroughly accustomed to the peculiar acoustic quirks of century-old architecture. When floorboards groaned or old window sash weights rattled in their pockets, he simply logged them as minor renovation tasks to address in due time. However, by mid-November 2022, winter arrived early in northwestern Illinois. Heavy sleet storms gave way to sustained freezing temperatures, coating the bluffs in sheets of gray ice and cutting off easy vehicle travel down the unpaved lane. Julian spent almost all his waking hours indoors, focusing his attention on the large, neglected formal study located at the back of the ground floor. The study was an unusual room. It featured heavy dark oak wall paneling, a sealed brick hearth, and wall-to-wall industrial carpeting that was stiff, discolored, and held down with rusted perimeter tack strips. The previous owner had evidently installed the thick carpet sometime in the late 1980s to cover whatever lay beneath. Whenever the outdoor temperature dropped into the single digits, Julian noticed that the air directly over the center of this carpeted room was consistently 10 to 15 degrees colder than the rest of the ground floor, carrying a faint, unmistakable scent of mineral dust, damp lime mortar, and stagnant water. On the evening of the 3rd of December, 2022, Julian decided it was finally time to strip the unsightly carpet down to the subfloor. He strapped on a pair of heavy leather work gloves, positioned a utility knife, and began cutting the carpet into manageable 2-foot strips along the east wall. As he pulled the thick, decaying foam underlayment away from the floorboards near the center of the room, his pry bar caught against a raised seam in the wood. Julian pulled the remaining section of carpet back with a hard, decisive jerk, sending a small cloud of dry gray dust into the beam of his halogen work lamp. Resting directly in the center of the bare pine subfloor was a square wooden trapdoor, measuring roughly 3 feet by 3 feet. The hatch was flush with the surrounding floorboards, framed by heavy iron strapping that had oxidized into a dull, velvety dark brown. In the center of the hatch sat a recessed iron ring pull held flat by a rusted pivot pin. What caught Julian's attention immediately, however, was not the existence of a cellar hatch in an old farmhouse, but rather the way it had been secured. Across the seam of the trapdoor, 2 heavy flat steel brackets had been anchored directly into the surrounding subfloor joists with 6 heavy 3-inch hex lag bolts. Furthermore, someone had driven several large steel masonry nails directly through the frame of the hatch itself, effectively pinning the door shut against its wooden ledge. It was not simply closed, it had been deliberately, forcefully sealed from above. Julian knelt beside the hatch, inspecting the oxidized steel brackets under the glare of his halogen light. The ironwork looked vintage, but the steel brackets and hex bolts appeared far newer, dating perhaps to the early 1990s. A wave of professional curiosity overcame him. In older Victorian homes across the Midwest, hidden cellar access panels often led to forgotten fruit cellars, coal bunkers, or historical cisterns that had simply fallen out of use when modern plumbing was installed. Julian grabbed an adjustable socket wrench from his tool bag, knelt over the first bracket, and began loosening the bolts. The steel bolts resisted at first, shrieking loudly as the rusted threads broke free from the centuries-old oak joists beneath. One by one, Julian extracted all 12 lag bolts, tossing the rusted hardware into an empty plastic paint bucket. He then wedged his flat pry bar beneath the seams of the hatch, prying up the heavy masonry nails until the wood gave a sharp, wet crack. Julian hooked his fingers around the recessed iron ring pull, planted his work boots firmly against the pine floorboards, and pulled upward with all his strength. With a deep, resonant groan of protesting wood and grinding iron hinges, the heavy square trapdoor swung open, falling back against the bare subfloor with a dull thud. A sudden, freezing updraft rushed out from the dark square void in the floor, carrying a smell so dense, stale, and metallic that Julian had to pull his shirt collar over his nose and mouth to keep from coughing. The air did not smell like an ordinary earthen basement. It smelled like ancient stone, wet iron, and a strange, sweet organic decay that reminded him of wet river silt baking in the sun. Julian picked up his high-powered LED rechargeable spotlight, walked to the edge of the opening, and pointed the beam downward into the dark. Directly beneath the hatch was a steep, narrow flight of rough-hewn limestone steps, descending at a sharp 45-degree angle into the earth. The stone steps were completely dry, covered in a fine layer of white efflorescence and loose limestone grit. The space did not match the layout of the standard crawlspace located under the rest of the house. It extended far deeper, tunneling directly downward beneath the natural bedrock shelf on which the house was built. Julian shone the light as far down the stone staircase as the beam would reach. Roughly 20 feet below, the steps ended at a low-ceilinged corridor constructed of dry-stacked limestone blocks, stretching horizontally into the shadows toward the rear bluff behind the property. Julian checked his watch. It was 9:45 in the evening. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees against the study window panes. He knew he should have waited until daylight to explore the subterranean structure, but the architectural mystery was simply too compelling to ignore. He clipped a small emergency flashlight to his belt, grabbed his primary LED spotlight, and stepped carefully onto the first limestone tread. The stone was shockingly cold, sending a chill straight through the thick rubber soles of his work boots. Step by step, Julian descended into the narrow subterranean shaft, the ceiling lowering until he was forced to bend his neck and shoulders forward to avoid striking his head on the rough bedrock ceiling above. When his boots finally touched the flat stone floor at the bottom of the staircase, he found himself standing in a narrow, vaulted corridor roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide. The corridor extended for approximately 30 feet before terminating at a heavy, reinforced wooden door built from thick vertical oak planks bound together by 3 horizontal iron straps. Unlike the trapdoor above, this door had no exterior padlock or latch. Instead, a large circular iron wheel, similar to the pressure wheel on a vintage vault or an industrial bulkhead, was set directly into the center of the oak planks. Julian approached the door slowly, the beam of his spotlight illuminating deep scratches and gouges cut across the face of the wood, running diagonally from the top left corner down to the bottom right. He reached out with his gloved right hand and placed his fingers on the cold iron spokes of the circular wheel. He applied pressure. For a few seconds, the wheel refused to budge, frozen by decades of oxidation. Julian grunted, leaning his entire body weight into the turn. With a loud, metallic clank that echoed sharply through the stone corridor, the internal locking dogs disengaged. The heavy oak door slowly swung inward by 3 inches, drifting open under its own weight into the pitch-black chamber beyond. Julian pushed the door the rest of the way open, holding his spotlight high above his head as he crossed the threshold. The chamber was roughly 12 feet square, entirely hand-carved directly out of the solid limestone bluff. In the center of the room sat a single, heavy wooden table with a straight-backed chair positioned behind it. Resting on the surface of the table was an old battery-operated shortwave radio receiver, several empty glass mason jars, a rusted oil lamp, and a large, leather-bound municipal ledger book with its spine cracked open. Julian stepped toward the table, the sound of his boots crunching loudly on the dry limestone floor. He aimed his spotlight down at the open page of the ledger. The handwriting across the yellowed parchment was dated from October of 1991 through March of 1993, written in the frantic, unsteady script of Walter Halloway, the previous owner. Julian leaned closer, reading the final paragraph written at the bottom of the page, dated the 14th of March, 1993. The entry read, "The subterranean shelf extends beyond the bluff line into the old mining cavity. The sounds do not originate from the riverbed. They are coming from behind the drainage conduit in the west bulkhead. I have welded the intermediate hatch, but the pressure continues to rise against the lower seal every time the ground freezes. If the upper hatch is unbolted from the study floor, the drafts will equalize and the seal on the lower bulkhead will give way. It must remain bolted down under the floor, covering forever." Julian felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of his stomach. He slowly raised the beam of his spotlight from the table, panning the light toward the far western wall of the limestone chamber. There, half concealed behind a crumbling stack of limestone rubble, was a narrow, circular iron drainage conduit roughly 3 feet in diameter, set deep into the solid rock wall. The heavy circular steel plate that had once sealed the mouth of the conduit was bent outward at a violent 45-degree angle, its heavy retaining rivets sheared cleanly off as though forced from the inside. And from deep within the pitch-black darkness of the open conduit pipe, 40 feet beneath the frozen ground of the property, Julian heard a slow, wet, dragging sound, followed by the faint, rhythmic scraping of metal against raw stone, moving steadily closer toward the chamber entrance. Julian stood frozen in the cold limestone chamber, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn and run. The sound coming from inside the drainage conduit grew louder and more defined. It was not the movement of a small wild animal. It was heavy, rhythmic, and deliberate. The wet, abrasive sound of heavy canvas or rubber sliding across jagged stone, accompanied by the distinct clinking of rusted metal chain links dragging across the floor of the pipe. Julian did not wait to see what emerged from the darkness. He lunged backward across the threshold of the chamber, grabbed the heavy oak door by its iron frame, and hauled it shut with all the strength in his upper body. The heavy timber slammed into the rock jam with a concussive boom that rattled loose limestone dust from the ceiling. Julian grabbed the circular iron wheel, throwing his entire weight into turning the spokes clockwise until the locking dogs slammed home into the stone wall. A split second after the latches caught, a violent impact struck the other side of the heavy oak door. The entire timber frame bowed outward by an inch, sending a dull, shuddering shockwave through Julian's arms as he held the wheel. Whatever was on the other side threw its weight against the wood a second time, followed by a frantic, jagged scraping sound across the iron banding. Julian let go of the wheel, turned on his heel, and sprinted down the narrow vaulted corridor. He hit the rough-hewn stone staircase at a full run, scrambling up the steep incline on his hands and feet, scraping his palms and knees against the jagged limestone steps. He surged up through the floor, opening into the study, grabbed the wooden edge of the square trapdoor, and threw it down into its frame. The heavy hatch slammed shut with a deafening crack. Julian scrambled across the floor, grabbed his heavy iron pry bar, and jammed the steel wedge deep beneath the perimeter framing of the hatch to brace it against the subfloor. He then dragged his heavy, cast-iron tool chest, weighing nearly 200 pounds, directly over the center of the trapdoor, followed by a solid oak bookshelf he overturned across the seam. He collapsed onto the subfloor, his chest heaving, his hands covered in gray stone dust and blood from scraped knuckles. From deep beneath the floorboards, muffled through 20 feet of bedrock and thick pine framing, came two dull, rhythmic thuds, vibrating faintly through the floor of the study. Then, the house fell into absolute, suffocating silence. Julian grabbed his phone from his work jacket, dialed 911, and reported a potential trespasser or active breach in the historical foundation tunnels beneath his property. Within 25 minutes, 3 cruisers from the Joe Daviess County Sheriff Department navigated the icy gravel lane. When deputies arrived, Julian, shivering and visibly shaken, explained the situation, showed them the open subfloor in the rear study, and handed them Walter Halloway's leather-bound ledger. The deputies treated the incident as a hazardous search and rescue operation. They called in local fire department personnel equipped with confined space gear, air quality monitors, and high-intensity tactical lighting. 2 armed deputies and a firefighter moved the heavy barricades, opened the trapdoor, and carefully descended the limestone steps to clear the subterranean complex. When they reached the vaulted room behind the bulkhead door, the chamber was dead silent. The circular conduit on the west wall was inspected with long-range bore cameras and tactical lights. Beyond the broken steel plate lay an extensive, unmapped network of 19th-century abandoned lead and zinc mining tunnels that honeycombed the entire bluff system beneath galena tunnels that had been officially condemned and sealed with concrete bulkheads along the riverbanks in the early 1930s. Roughly 60 feet inside the conduit pipe, emergency personnel made a gruesome and baffling discovery. Lying wedged inside the narrow stone shaft was a fully preserved, heavy industrial diving harness and canvas immersion suit dating back to the late 1960s, equipped with vintage lead ballast weights, an oxidized brass air valve, and a severed steel safety cable. Inside the heavy canvas suit were the skeletal remains of a man. When the Illinois State Police Forensic Unit processed the remains and matched dental records against historical missing persons reports, the truth behind Walter Halloway's cryptic ledger entries was finally pieced together. The remains belonged to Arthur Vance, a regional civil engineer and subterranean surveyor who had mysteriously vanished in November of 1968 while conducting an illegal, independent inspection of the flooded mining cavities connected to the municipal storm drainage system. For decades, local folklore had assumed Vance had drowned in the Mississippi River after his boat was found adrift near the bluffs. In reality, Vance had penetrated the flooded mining shafts from the lower river entrance, became trapped when an interior collapse crushed his return line, and perished deep within the bedrock labyrinth. The terrifying twist, however, was not the discovery of the decades-old remains, but what had caused them to move toward the hatch on the night Julian unbolted the door. Mining engineers called to inspect the site determined that the abandoned subterranean network was connected to a deep subterranean hydraulic pressure pocket tied to the rising winter water table of the Galena River. When Walter Halloway had welded and bolted the upper trapdoor shut in 1993, he had created an airtight seal that held the hydraulic equilibrium stable between the flooded river conduits and the dry limestone chamber beneath the house. The moment Julian Mercer unbolted the lag bolts and pulled open the heavy trapdoor in the study, the sudden atmospheric pressure drop equalized through the limestone shaft like a massive subterranean siphon. The violent rush of displaced air and subterranean water had forced open the weakened iron conduit plate, creating a powerful hydraulic suction current that dragged the heavy, lead-weighted diving suit and rusted safety chains through 60 feet of jagged stone pipe directly toward the chamber door. There had been no living intruder in the tunnels that night. Julian had come face to face with the preserved remnants of a 50-year-old cold case, literally pulled from the dark by the simple act of opening a sealed door. Julian packed his tools the next morning. He permanently sealed the trapdoor with 8 inches of reinforced structural concrete, repaired the subfloor, and sold the property at the beginning of 2023, never again questioning why some doors in old houses were meant to stay sealed. On the bitterly cold morning of the 12th of February, 2021, inside the police department headquarters in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Detective Thomas Wright was reviewing overnight traffic reports when a call came through from the front intake desk. The desk officer sounded distinctly unnerved, stating that a young woman had just staggered into the main lobby barefoot in the snow, claiming she had escaped a violent abduction that had taken place only hours prior. Thomas immediately walked down the hallway to the intake interview room. Sitting on the vinyl chairs was 24-year-old Chloe Henderson, a freelance graphic illustrator and part-time bookstore employee who lived in a quiet residential neighborhood near Heritage Hill. Chloe was in a severe state of physical and emotional trauma. Her hands and ankles exhibited deep, raw lacerations consistent with tight zip-tie bindings, her winter coat was torn at the seams, her lip was split, and her dark hair was matted with dried dirt and melting road slush. She was hyperventilating, shivering uncontrollably beneath a heavy emergency blanket and clutching a small, half-melted plastic water bottle between trembling fingers. Thomas sat across from her, took out his notepad, and gently asked her to explain what had happened. According to Chloe, the nightmare had started the previous night, February 11th, at approximately 11:30. She had stayed late at the bookstore downtown to reorganize inventory, leaving through the rear alleyway to walk to her apartment 4 blocks away. She stated that, as she turned the corner onto Lyon Street, a dark, unmarked cargo van with rusted wheel wells pulled abruptly up to the curb. 2 men wearing dark balaclavas and heavy canvas work jackets lunged out of the sliding side door, threw a rough burlap hood over her head, zip-tied her wrists and ankles, and threw her into the rear cargo hold. Chloe recounted that she was driven for nearly 2 hours down winding, unpaved roads into a rural, heavily wooded area. She was then carried down a steep flight of wooden stairs into an ice-cold subterranean basement smelling of raw copper, motor oil, and damp dirt. She described being chained to an exposed cast iron pipe beneath the floor joists while her captors spoke in low, muffled voices in an adjoining room, discussing plans to demand a large financial ransom from her estranged father, a wealthy real estate attorney in Chicago. Around 5 in the morning, while the two men were apparently upstairs arguing, Chloe managed to use the sharp edge of an exposed masonry screw on the foundation wall to saw through the plastic zip ties binding her wrists. She slipped out through a small, ground-level hopper window in the basement wall, ran blindly through the frozen pine woods in the pitch-black darkness, and eventually flagged down an early morning commuter along the shoulder of Northland Drive, who drove her directly to the police station. Thomas took detailed notes, immediately ordering a comprehensive forensic medical examination and securing her torn clothing for DNA evidence. Every detail of Chloe's story was horrifying, consistent, and delivered with the raw, visceral terror of a genuine survivor. The Grand Rapids Police Department immediately launched a massive priority investigation. Because the crime involved an interstate ransom motive and violent felony kidnapping, Thomas coordinated with county sheriff units and regional state investigators to pull traffic camera feeds, check automated license plate readers along Lion Street, and locate the dark cargo van. By 3 in the afternoon, Thomas and his partner, Detective Martin Davis, sat inside the department digital media processing lab to review the city surveillance footage covering the exact intersection of Lion Street and the bookstore alleyway during the timeline of the reported abduction. The security system operated high-definition, commercial-grade digital cameras with excellent infrared night vision capabilities, providing an unobstructed view of the entire block. Thomas cued the timecode to 11:25 on the night of February 11th and pressed play. On the screen, the quiet, snow-dusted street was practically deserted. The halogen streetlights cast long, sharp shadows across the sidewalks. At exactly 11:31, the rear metal door of the bookstore swung open. Chloe stepped out into the alleyway, wearing her winter coat, shouldering her canvas bag, and pulling her wool scarf tight against the freezing wind. Thomas leaned forward toward the monitor, expecting to see the dark cargo van pull up and the masked men emerge from the shadows. Instead, what the detectives saw on the high-resolution footage made them freeze in total bewilderment. Chloe walked down the alleyway alone. She reached the sidewalk on Lion Street, paused under the streetlight for roughly 30 seconds, pulled her smartphone from her pocket, and typed a quick message. There was no van, there was no vehicle idling at the curb, there were no masked assailants hiding in the shadows. At 11:33, Chloe calmly turned south on Division Avenue, completely unhurried, walking at a relaxed, steady pace toward her own apartment building. Thomas rubbed his eyes in disbelief, wondering if there was a timecode synchronization error on the municipal server. He immediately cross-referenced the feeds from 3 separate private business cameras along Division Avenue, a bank ATM, a coffee shop, and a 24-hour convenience store. All 3 cameras showed the exact same thing. Chloe, walking entirely alone through the quiet streets, entering the front glass lobby of her secure apartment building at 11:42, unlocking the security door with her key fob, and stepping inside without a single sign of distress or pursuit. Detective Davis let out a low whistle, looking over at Thomas. Did she fabricate the entire story? Did she inflict those injuries on herself to stage a hoax? Thomas shook his head slowly. The deep ligature marks on Chloe's wrists, the heavy abrasions on her ankles, and the sheer biological panic she had exhibited in the interview room were virtually impossible to fake. A person staging a hoax for attention does not cut their own wrists down to the tissue or freeze their feet to the point of second-degree frostbite. Something horrific had undeniably happened to her, but the timeline and the location she had provided were entirely impossible. Thomas pulled up the apartment building's private interior hallway camera feeds, which the property manager had just emailed over to the precinct. The hallway footage showed Chloe walking up the stairs to her third-floor apartment at 11:44, entering her unit and firmly locking the deadbolt behind her. For nearly 3 hours, the hallway remained completely still and empty. Then, at exactly 2:28 in the morning, the door to Chloe's apartment swung open from the inside. Chloe stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, but she was no longer wearing her shoes, her winter coat, or her scarf. She was wearing only thin flannel pajamas and wool socks. Her posture was completely rigid. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and her head was tilted back at an unnatural, awkward angle. She did not walk down the hallway toward the main front exit. Instead, she turned toward the back fire exit at the end of the corridor, an exit that led directly down into the private, subterranean parking garage and maintenance boiler rooms beneath the historic apartment building. Thomas fast-forwarded the timestamp on the underground garage camera. At 2:35 in the morning, the heavy steel fire door opened, and Chloe entered the concrete garage. She walked past the parked vehicles in the center aisle, moving with that same eerie, stiff, mechanical gait, heading straight toward the far, unlit corner behind the commercial boiler tanks where an old, heavy iron maintenance hatch was set into the foundation wall. As Chloe approached the iron hatch, the motion sensor security light on the ceiling suddenly switched on, illuminating the dark alcove in harsh white glare. Standing beside the open iron hatch, waiting for her in the shadows, was a tall figure wearing a dark canvas coat, heavy work boots, and holding a thick bundle of heavy black plastic zip ties in his hands. And as the figure stepped forward into the full beam of the security light to take Chloe by the arm, the camera captured his face with absolute, undeniable clarity. The face, illuminated under the harsh fluorescent garage light, was not a stranger, an unknown drifter, or a professional kidnapper. It was Dr. Julian Vance, a respected 49-year-old clinical neurologist and sleep medicine specialist at the Grand Rapids Regional Medical Center, the very same physician who had been treating Chloe for severe chronic parasomnia and non-REM sleep disturbances for the past 8 months. Thomas and Davis stared at the screen in complete disbelief. The security footage showed Dr. Vance speaking in a low, calm voice directly into Chloe's ear, handing her a small paper cup of water containing a dissolved liquid sedative, which Chloe drank without resistance while still locked in an active, somnambulic state. Vance then systematically bound her wrists and ankles with the heavy plastic zip ties, threw a rough burlap hood over her head, and dragged her through the heavy iron maintenance door, leading down into the decommissioned sub-basement infrastructure beneath the city block. Thomas immediately dispatched 6 patrol units and a SWAT tactical entry team to Dr. Vance's private medical clinic and suburban residence in East Grand Rapids. Within 40 minutes, officers breached Dr. Vance's expansive estate, placing him under arrest in his private study as he sat at his desk reviewing patient clinical files on his laptop. When forensic teams, accompanied by building engineers, searched the subterranean maintenance tunnels beneath Chloe's apartment complex, the entire horrifying scope of the operation was revealed. The decommissioned boiler rooms connected directly to a network of historic utility conduits dating back to the 1920s, running directly beneath several residential properties in Heritage Hill. Vance had rented an old commercial storage unit connected to those tunnels, outfitting the underground vault as an isolated observation facility. When investigators examined the digital files seized from Vance's clinic servers, the chilling psychological reality behind Chloe's report came into clear focus. Chloe had not lied about what she experienced. In her fractured, traumatized mind, the burlap hood, the zip ties, the cold stone floor, and the voices talking about ransom were all terrifyingly real memories. However, because Vance had been prescribing her high doses of experimental hypnotic sedatives to deliberately exploit and deepen her severe sleepwalking disorder, Chloe's brain had entirely confabulated the context of the trauma. When she awoke in the subterranean bunker and managed to escape through the maintenance window, her conscious mind tried to rationalize the horrific ordeal by inventing a daytime street kidnapping scenario on Lion Street, completely unaware that she had walked down into the basement herself under chemical hypnosis. Vance was not holding her for a crude financial ransom. His private digital research logs revealed that he had been conducting illegal, highly classified human behavioral conditioning experiments using targeted sleep deprivation and pharmacological triggers to test whether severe parasomnia patients could be systematically guided to commit complex physical acts without conscious memory. Vance was formally indicted in federal district court on charges of aggravated kidnapping, unlawful human experimentation, distribution of controlled substances, and healthcare fraud. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. Chloe received specialized psychological trauma therapy and relocated to Chicago to be closer to her family. Having finally learned the truth about why the security footage didn't match her memories, and that the real monster had been hiding behind a lab coat and a medical degree, in early October of 2019, a 38-year-old backcountry wilderness ranger named Garrett Cole was stationed at a remote seasonal outpost in the Shoshone National Forest, located in northwestern Wyoming. Garrett was a seasoned woodsman with over 12 years of search and rescue experience across the rugged Absaroka mountain range. He knew the jagged terrain, the unpredictable mountain weather, and the dense wilderness corridors better than almost anyone in the district. His primary station for the autumn season was the Dunoir Guard Station, an isolated timber cabin situated more than 15 miles past the nearest paved road, accessible only by high-clearance four-wheel drive vehicles or pack horses. The cabin had no cell service, relying entirely on a satellite dispatch terminal and a high-frequency two-way radio system connected to the regional ranger headquarters in Dubois. Autumn in the high Absarokas is notoriously short and treacherous. By the second week of October, the aspen leaves had already turned crisp gold and dropped to the forest floor. The subalpine streams were skimming over with morning ice, and the first major winter storm system was forecast to push over the Continental Divide within 48 hours. Most seasonal backpackers and hunting outfitters had already packed up their camps and retreated to lower elevations. On the afternoon of October 11th, around 3:30, Garrett was sitting on the wooden porch of the outpost, cleaning his pack equipment and monitoring the radio, when an emergency priority dispatch broke through the static. The dispatch coordinator in Dubois reported that a solo hiker named Trevor Harrison, a 26-year-old software engineer from Boise, Idaho, had failed to return from a planned 4-day traverse across the remote Washakie Wilderness. Trevor was an experienced trail runner equipped with lightweight survival gear, an orange mountaineering shell jacket, and a satellite emergency beacon. However, Trevor's beacon had failed to send its daily check-in ping for 3 consecutive days, and the incoming blizzard was expected to dump up to 2 feet of heavy snow across the high passes by the following morning. Given Garrett's proximity to the last known trailhead coordinates, he was instructed to pack emergency medical gear, cold weather bivouac equipment, and food rations, then initiate an immediate preliminary sweep along the Bear Creek drainage trail before the storm hit. Garrett loaded his 60-liter expedition pack, strapped on his sidearm, checked his GPS unit, and set out into the wilderness on foot by 4 o'clock. The air was bitterly cold, hovering around 28 degrees, with a sharp, biting wind sweeping down from the jagged limestone cliffs above the tree line. The forest was eerily quiet. The typical sounds of birds and small mammals were completely absent, replaced only by the dry crunch of frozen pine needles under Garrett's mountaineering boots and the distant, hollow roar of wind moving through the high canopy of Douglas firs. For nearly 4 hours, Garrett pushed hard along the switchbacks of the Bear Creek Trail, ascending from 7,000 feet up toward the steep, rocky saddle near 9,000 feet. As twilight faded into pitch blackness around 8 in the evening, Garrett clicked on his high-powered LED headlamp, sweeping the wide beam across the dense stands of timber and rocky talus slopes. The temperature plummeted into the high teens. Light, powdery snow flurries began to drift through the tree branches, reducing visibility to less than 30 yards. Garrett regularly blew an emergency rescue whistle, 3 sharp, piercing blasts that echoed across the canyon walls, followed by several minutes of absolute stillness as he paused to listen for any human response. At approximately 9:45, as Garrett reached the edge of a wide, glacial meadow surrounded by towering lodgepole pines, his whistle blast produced an answer. Faint, cracked, and trembling, a human voice called out from the dark timber roughly 100 yards off the main trail to the west. Garrett immediately adjusted his pack, unclipped his radio, and shouted into the darkness, identifying himself as a National Park Service Ranger. The voice called back, desperate and frantic. "Over here! Please! By the deadfall!" Garrett moved swiftly through the deep scrub and fallen logs, his headlamp beam cutting through the swirling snow flurries. As he climbed over a massive tangle of downed timber near a dry creek bed, his light caught a bright splash of orange fabric. Sitting curled up against the hollow base of a massive, lightning-scarred spruce tree was a young man matching Trevor Harrison's physical description. He was wearing a torn orange mountaineering jacket, heavy trekking pants coated in frozen mud, and trail-running gaiters. His face was pale, his lips were cracked and blue from early-stage hypothermia, and his hands were trembling uncontrollably inside thin fleece gloves. Beside him lay a lightweight trekking pole snapped in half, and a compact gray day pack with its zipper split open. Garrett immediately dropped to his knees, set down his pack, and began standard cold-weather field triage. Trevor was conscious, coherent, and utterly overwhelmed with relief, breaking into tears as Garrett wrapped a thick wool survival blanket around his shoulders and handed him an insulated flask of hot electrolyte broth. Trevor explained in a shaky, breathless voice that he had lost the trail 3 days earlier during a sudden fog bank, slipped on wet shale while trying to navigate a ridge, tumbled down a 60-foot ravine, and fractured his left ankle. His satellite beacon had broken on impact against the rocks, leaving him completely stranded without communication. For 3 days, he had survived by melting snow in his water bottle, rationing 2 energy bars, and dragging himself inch by inch toward the creek bed in search of shelter. Garrett quickly examined Trevor's left leg. The ankle was severely swollen, discolored with deep purple bruising, and completely unable to bear weight. Garrett skillfully splinted the joint with padded aluminum splints and compression wraps, administered pain medication, and gave Trevor high-calorie food rations. Garrett pulled his satellite communicator from his chest pouch to relay their exact GPS coordinates back to the Dubois Dispatch Center, intending to request a morning helicopter evacuation once the weather cleared. However, when Garrett powered on the satellite handset, the screen flashed a continuous red error message: "Satellite link offline, heavy cloud obstruction." The incoming front was already too dense, cutting off all satellite uplinks and high-frequency radio transmissions. Looking at the sky, Garrett realized that a severe blizzard would bury the meadow in deep drifts within hours. Staying out in an open bivvy with an injured, hypothermic patient in sub-zero blizzard conditions was extremely dangerous. Fortunately, Garrett knew that an old, historic backcountry line cabin used by trail crews in the 1970s stood less than 2 miles down the valley near the confluence of Bear Creek and the East Fork. The small cabin had a functional cast-iron wood stove, stacked firewood, and solid log walls that would easily shelter them from the storm until a ground search team arrived the next day. Garrett helped Trevor to his feet, having the injured hiker lean heavily on his shoulders, using a sturdy birch branch Garrett cut as a makeshift crutch. The 2-mile trek through the deepening snow was brutal and agonizingly slow. The wind howled through the high passes, driving freezing snow directly into their faces. Trevor groaned in pain with every step, his weight dragging heavily against Garrett's side. But, through grit and determination, Garrett kept the young man moving forward through the pitch-black forest, step by painful step. At around 11:30 at night, the dark silhouette of the line cabin emerged through the whiteout conditions. The cabin was a modest, square log structure with a steep tin roof and a heavy wooden door secured with a simple sliding latch. Garrett pushed the door open, helped Trevor inside, and settled him onto a wooden bunk fitted with an old foam mattress in the corner. Garrett quickly set to work. He used his flashlight to inspect the cabin, cleared out the cast-iron stove, built a fire using dry cedar kindling, and split lodgepole pine logs from the indoor wood box, and soon had a roaring, crackling fire throwing heat and warm yellow light across the rough-hewn log walls. The cabin warmed up quickly, the freezing mountain air replaced by the comforting scent of dry pine smoke, melting snow, and wool. Garrett removed Trevor's wet outer shell, wrapped him in a dry thermal sleeping bag from his pack, and placed a pot of water on top of the stove to boil for warm tea. Trevor lay back against the bunk, color slowly returning to his face, breathing deeply in the warmth of the cabin. He looked up at Garrett with deep gratitude, repeatedly thanking him for saving his life, stating that he had genuinely believed he was going to freeze to death alone in the meadow. Garrett sat down on a wooden bench beside the table, pulled off his heavy winter gloves, and unzipped Trevor's torn gray day pack to retrieve the injured hiker's identification wallet and personal effects for the standard search and rescue incident log. Garrett pulled out a soggy Idaho driver's license confirming the hiker's identity as Trevor Harrison, a spare set of wool socks, a pocket knife, a broken satellite beacon, and a water-resistant digital trail camera inside a padded side pocket. Garrett opened the camera's battery latch, wiped away condensation from the lens, and powered it on to verify the date stamps of the trail route, a routine practice rangers use to document backcountry incidents. The digital display lit up, showing a photo gallery of 74 images recorded over the previous 5 days. Garrett clicked through the first several photos. They showed beautiful panoramic vistas of the high Absaroka ridges, scenic trail selfies of Trevor smiling at the trailhead on October 7th, and pictures of mountain passes taken during the early days of his trek. Then, Garrett clicked to photo number 71, which carried an automated camera timestamp from October 9th, 2 days after Trevor had supposedly fallen and broken his ankle in the ravine. The image was a clear, wide shot of the very line cabin they were currently sitting in. Garrett's finger hovered over the plastic navigation button. He felt a sudden, cold prickle of unease rise along his neck. He clicked to photo number 72. It was taken from inside the cabin, showing the cast-iron wood stove fully lit, with a kettle sitting on top of the iron plate. The timestamp read October 10th at 4 in the afternoon. Garrett slowly clicked to photo 73, taken the previous evening, October 10th at 9:30. The photograph showed a close-up of a handwritten note resting on the exact wooden table where Garrett was now sitting. The handwriting on the note was clean, deliberate, and entirely legible. The note read, "The ranger at Dunoir will come out when the satellite ping fails. Keep the splint on until he brings the pack inside." Garrett sat completely still in the warm cabin, the crackle of the wood stove suddenly sounding deafening in his ears. He slowly lowered the camera display, his eyes shifting across the room toward the wooden bunk in the corner. Lying beneath the thermal sleeping bag, Trevor was no longer shivering. His breathing was calm, steady, and entirely rhythmic. His swollen, heavily wrapped left leg was resting flat on the mattress. And as Garrett looked at the corner of the room, he realized that Trevor's eyes were wide open in the firelight, staring directly at the heavy expedition pack resting beside Garrett's boots, with a calm, cold smile spreading slowly across his face. The warm air inside the small log cabin suddenly felt suffocating. Garrett did not move a muscle. His right hand remained resting flat on the wooden tabletop, inches from his holstered sidearm, while his left thumb gripped the plastic edge of the digital camera. Trevor did not break eye contact. The helpless, trembling demeanor of the hypothermic hiker had vanished completely, replaced by a chilling, predatory stillness. Slowly, without a single wince of pain, Trevor swung his splinted left leg off the edge of the mattress and placed his bare foot firmly onto the floorboards, putting full, deliberate weight on the limb Garrett had spent 20 minutes carefully binding. Garrett's voice was low, steady, and sharp. "Stand down, Trevor. Keep your hands on that mattress." Trevor let out a quiet, raspy chuckle that cut through the hiss of the cast iron stove. He did not raise his hands. Instead, he reached slowly behind the foam pillow on the bunk, his fingers wrapping around the grip of a compact semi-automatic pistol that had been tucked between the logs and the mattress long before Garrett ever kicked open the cabin door. Trevor was not a lost hiker who had stumbled into bad luck. The line cabin was not a random shelter. It was an ambush. Before Trevor could fully clear the barrel from behind the pillow, Garrett's 12 years of law enforcement reflexes took over. Garrett threw his entire upper body weight forward, flipping the heavy pine table straight into Trevor's chest. The heavy wood crashed into Trevor, pinning his torso against the log wall and deflecting the first gunshot with a deafening crack that sent a bullet tearing upward through the tin roof. The small cabin filled instantly with white, acrid gun smoke and the sharp smell of burnt cordite. Garrett lunged across the overturned table, driving his shoulder into Trevor's ribs and locking both hands around Trevor's right wrist. The two men crashed hard onto the floorboards in front of the roaring wood stove, sending glowing embers scattering across the dry timber. Trevor fought with violent, manic intensity, kicking and twisting, trying to wrench the pistol around toward Garrett's head. But Garrett used his superior size and leverage, slamming Trevor's wrist repeatedly against the cast iron leg of the wood stove until the handgun slipped from Trevor's fingers, sliding under the lower bunk into the dark. Garrett drove a heavy forearm across Trevor's collarbone, pinned him flat against the floorboards, and pulled his department-issued steel handcuffs from his belt pouch, ratcheting them tightly behind Trevor's wrists with two sharp metallic clicks. Garrett rolled the man onto his stomach, secured his ankles with heavy nylon utility cord from his pack, and stood up, his chest heaving, his ears ringing from the close-quarters gunshot. He retrieved Trevor's pistol, cleared the chamber, and placed it safely inside his own vest pouch. For the next 10 hours, as the blizzard raged outside and buried the cabin in nearly 3 feet of snow, Garrett sat beside the glowing stove, with his hand resting on his service weapon, guarding his prisoner in total silence until the storm finally broke at dawn. When the skies cleared mid-morning, the emergency satellite link restored, and a high-altitude UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter carrying a tactical response team from the Fremont County Sheriff Department and the United States Forest Service landed in the snowfield outside the cabin. When state and federal investigators ran Trevor Harrison's fingerprints through the National Crime Information Center database, the full, shocking scope of the setup was laid bare. The man in the cabin was not Trevor Harrison. His real name was Russell Vance, a 31-year-old fugitive wanted by federal authorities across 3 western states in connection with an armed robbery of a regional Forest Service repository in Idaho 2 weeks earlier. Russell had stolen the identification, jacket, and trail gear of the real Trevor Harrison after ambushing him at a distant trailhead in Idaho days prior, an incident that prompted a regional multi-agency manhunt. Knowing that backcountry rangers possessed high-grade master keys, satellite tactical communications, survival equipment, and unrestricted access to seasonal government vehicles and outpost caches, Russell had hiked deep into the Washakie wilderness to stage his own rescue. He had scouted the Bear Creek line cabin days in advance, hidden a secondary weapon behind the bunk, intentionally triggered a broken beacon search pattern, and applied realistic theatrical makeup and cold-induced swelling to simulate a catastrophic fall in the ravine. His entire plan had been to lure a solo search ranger into the remote cabin during a whiteout blizzard, kill the rescuer in his sleep, take his credentials, uniform, and outpost keys, and use the isolated ranger station network as an undetected staging ground to slip past law enforcement checkpoints across the Continental Divide. The only reason Garrett Cole survived that night was a simple automated camera timestamp that Russell had forgotten to delete from the stolen daypack. Russell Vance was convicted in federal court on multiple counts of attempted murder of a federal officer, armed assault, and interstate fugitive flight, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Garrett returned to active duty in the Shoshone National Forest the following spring, but never again entered an isolated backcountry shelter without keeping his eyes fixed on the shadows. In the late autumn of 2021, a 40-year-old architectural draftsman and lifelong hunter named Brett Lawson bought an off-grid mountain retreat in the dense timberlands of Carbon County, Pennsylvania. Brett had spent nearly 15 years working long, demanding hours in downtown Philadelphia, staring at computerized blueprints, navigating crowded expressways, and dealing with the constant noise of the city. He had saved aggressively for over a decade with the singular ambition of purchasing a remote hunting camp where he could spend his autumns tracking white-tailed deer, processing his own firewood, and enjoying complete, uninterrupted solitude. The property he chose was a sturdy 1.5-story cedar log cabin located on an 8-acre private tract bordered on 3 sides by the dense, rocky expanses of the Weiser State Forest. The cabin sat nearly 4 miles past the nearest paved state route, accessible only by navigating a rough, unmaintained dirt fire road that wound through steep ravines and thick thickets of mountain laurel. It had no municipal power, relying instead on a high-capacity solar battery bank, a propane generator, and a central cast-iron wood stove that heated the entire ground floor and the open sleeping loft above. Brett took possession of the cabin in late October of 2021, just as the broadleaf trees across the Pocono foothills were turning brilliant shades of rust and gold before shedding their canopy to the forest floor. He immediately loved the property. The air smelled of dry pine needles, wet slate, and oak smoke. During the day, the surrounding wilderness was filled with the natural rustling of wildlife and the distant rushing of broad mountain runs. At night, however, when the autumn winds died down, the darkness settled over the valley like a heavy wool blanket, creating an acoustic silence so total that Brett could hear his own heartbeat whenever he stood on the back porch deck. Brett was an exceptionally methodical outdoorsman. To monitor the movements of game across his 8 acres, he purchased 5 brand-new, high-definition cellular trail cameras equipped with invisible black infrared flash technology, passive infrared motion sensors, and high-speed memory cards. Because cellular reception in the deep hollow was inconsistent, the cameras were programmed to store all high-resolution video clips and burst photographs locally on internal high-capacity memory drives, which Brett routinely collected and reviewed on his rugged field laptop every morning over black coffee. He mounted 4 of the cameras along well-worn deer runs, natural mineral licks, and game trails deep in the hardwood timber surrounding his cabin. The 5th camera, however, he mounted on the thick trunk of an ancient hemlock tree sitting roughly 40 yards behind the cabin, angling the wide field of view to cover the rear gravel yard, the outdoor firewood splitting block, and the rear sliding glass patio door that led into his ground floor kitchen. For the first 3 weeks of November, everything went smoothly. The cameras captured thousands of ordinary wildlife images: large 8-point bucks feeding on fallen acorns at dawn, wild turkeys wandering through the fern undergrowth, and the occasional black bear lumbering through the mountain laurel thickets. Brett spent his days chopping firewood, checking his property boundary markers, and preparing for the upcoming rifle hunting season. The subtle shift in the cabin atmosphere began on the evening of the 23rd of November 2021, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. A sharp, unseasonal cold front descended from the north, dropping the overnight temperatures into the low 20s and bringing heavy, swirling mountain fog that settled thick in the hollows. Brett spent the evening inside the cabin, stoking the cast-iron stove with seasoned red oak, cooking a simple meal, and reading a historical wilderness journal by the warm light of a propane mantle lamp. Around 11:45 that night, Brett turned off the lamps, climbed the open timber staircase to the upper sleeping loft, and went to bed beneath heavy wool quilts. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, Brett was pulled from a deep sleep by a faint, metallic noise coming from the exterior of the cabin. It was not the sharp crack of a dead branch falling on the tin roof, and it was not the heavy scrape of a black bear investigating the trash bins. It was a rhythmic, delicate sound, the slow, metallic sliding of the deadbolt latch on the rear patio door, as though someone on the outside were gently testing the tension of the brass lock cylinder with a flat metal tool. Brett sat completely motionless in his bed, his ears straining into the silence. He picked up his tactical flashlight and his holstered 9mm sidearm from the nightstand, clicked the safety off, and descended the timber stairs in absolute darkness without making a sound. He moved silently across the cold pine floorboards to the rear kitchen area. He switched on his flashlight, throwing a bright white beam through the sliding glass patio door. The rear gravel yard was completely empty. The thick mountain fog swirled past the glass in pale, ghostly sheets, obscuring the hemlock trees 40 yards away. The sliding glass door remained fully locked, its secondary aluminum security bar still firmly seated in the bottom track. Brett assumed that the sound had merely been the thermal contraction of the aluminum doorframe cooling rapidly in the freezing night air. He checked the front deadbolt, returned upstairs to the loft, and eventually drifted back to sleep around 4 in the morning. At 7 o'clock the following morning, November 24th, Brett awoke to clear, icy skies. The fog had lifted, leaving behind a crisp, frosty layer of white rime over the dead leaves and gravel. Brett made a fresh pot of coffee on the propane stove, pulled on his heavy canvas chore coat and boots, and walked out into the freezing morning air to collect the memory cards from his trail cameras for his daily review. He walked the perimeter of his property, swapping out the memory drives on cameras 1 through 4, before returning to the large hemlock tree 40 yards behind the cabin to retrieve the memory card from camera 5, the unit pointed directly at his rear patio door. Brett brought the small plastic storage case inside, sat down at the heavy oak dining table in front of the wood stove, and inserted the memory card from camera 5 into the side slot of his laptop. The computer screen populated a list of 48 video files recorded between 8 o'clock the previous evening and 6 o'clock that morning. Brett took a sip of hot coffee, clicked on the first batch of files, and began scrubbing through them. The early night clips from 8 to 11 showed nothing unusual, just the gentle sway of the hemlock branches in the wind, a pair of gray squirrels darting across the woodpile, and the soft amber light of the cabin lamps glowing through the living room windows before Brett went to bed. Then, Brett reached the file stamped with the time code 0214 in the morning, the exact time he had been awoken by the strange metallic sound at the rear door. Brett clicked the video file to play. Because the trail camera utilized invisible black infrared illuminators, the video was captured in stark, high-contrast monochrome night vision. At 02:14 and 10 seconds, the rear yard was completely quiet. The glass patio door was dark, reflecting the faint gray fog drifting across the grass. At 02:14 and 25 seconds, the video showed a tall, gaunt figure emerging smoothly from the dense mountain laurel thicket on the far left of the frame. The figure was dressed in heavy, dark canvas hunting clothing, wearing high rubber swamp boots and a tight dark knit cap pulled down low over the brow. The face was completely uncovered, revealing a middle-aged man with sharp, sunken cheekbones and an unblinking, vacant expression. The man was not carrying a hunting rifle, a flashlight, or a survival pack. In his right hand, he carried an old, heavy iron railway spike, gripping the rusted metal like a chisel. The video showed the man walking across the gravel yard with total familiarity, moving with an eerie, predatory silence directly toward the rear patio door. He reached the glass door at 02:15, leaned his forehead directly against the cold glass, and peered into the dark cabin interior for nearly 20 seconds. He then inserted the tip of the iron spike into the narrow gap between the sliding glass frame and the jamb, gently testing the lock mechanism, creating the exact metallic scraping sound that had woke Brett from his sleep. Brett sat frozen at his table, the coffee mug hovering inches from his lips, his chest tightening as he watched the recording. On the screen, the video showed the sudden flare of Brett's flashlight beam cutting across the kitchen from the inside. The moment the light hit the interior side of the glass, the man outside did not panic, turn, or flee into the woods. Instead, with terrifying speed and flexibility, the man dropped flat onto his stomach, sliding beneath the low wooden overhang of the rear porch deck, concealing himself completely in the dark crawl space beneath the floorboards just inches below where Brett had stood, shining his light into the yard. Brett watched in horror as the video continued. The clip showed Brett's flashlight beam sweep across the empty yard through the glass, linger for a minute, and then click off as Brett returned upstairs to the loft. For 10 minutes, the yard remained still. Then, at 02:32 in the morning, the next video file triggered. The man crawled slowly out from beneath the porch deck, covered in dry dirt and dead leaves. He stood up in the infrared light, wiped his hands on his canvas trousers, and looked directly into the lens of the trail camera mounted 40 yards away on the hemlock tree, as though he had known the camera was positioned there the entire time. The man walked across the gravel yard, stepping closer and closer to the hemlock trunk until his face filled the entire frame of the camera. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coat, pulled out a small, folded piece of yellow paper, and held it directly in front of the infrared sensor for 5 full seconds. Brett leaned forward, his nose nearly touching the laptop screen, pausing the video frame at the highest possible digital clarity. Written across the yellow paper in heavy black grease pencil was a single chilling sentence. "You put the new deadbolt on the bottom door, but you left the loft window latch open on the roof." Brett sat completely paralyzed in his chair, the warm air from the wood stove suddenly feeling suffocating. He slowly looked away from the computer screen, turning his head upward toward the high timber ceiling of the cabin. Directly above the dining table where he was sitting, on the south-facing slope of the second-floor sleeping loft, was a small, hinged dormer window that led directly out onto the flat, shingled roof of the rear wood shed. The small dormer window, which Brett had cracked open by 2 inches 2 days earlier to let fresh mountain air circulate through the loft, was now pushed completely wide open against the cedar siding. And, lying on the polished pine floorboards directly beneath the loft stairs, resting right beside Brett's hunting boots, was an old, rusted iron railway spike. Brett did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He didn't grab his heavy luggage, he didn't pack his hunting equipment, and he didn't even bother to close the open laptop sitting on the oak table. With his loaded 9mm drawn in his right hand, Brett snatched his truck keys and wallet from the counter, backed swiftly out through the heavy timber front door, slammed it shut, and bolted toward his 4-wheel drive truck parked in the gravel turnaround. He threw himself into the cab, hit the ignition, and locked all the doors in one violent, continuous motion. He shifted into reverse, spun gravel across the yard, and tore down the 4 miles of unmaintained fire road toward the state highway, throwing rooster tails of mud into the hemlock thickets without ever taking his eyes off the rearview mirror. The moment his phone reconnected to cellular towers near Route 903, Brett dialed the emergency dispatch line for the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Laheyton. Within 45 minutes, 3 marked state police cruisers and 2 wildlife conservation officers from the Pennsylvania Game Commission met Brett at the trailhead turnoff, coordinating an armed tactical return to the cabin. State troopers approached the secluded property with weapons drawn, surrounding the perimeter and establishing a security cordon along the wood line before clearing the interior. The log cabin was entirely empty. However, forensic evidence of the terrifying intrusion was everywhere. When troopers climbed the timber stairs to inspect the upper sleeping loft, they discovered that the gaunt intruder had not merely left a warning note. After Brett had turned off his flashlight and fallen back asleep around 4 in the morning, the man had climbed the firewood stack onto the low shed roof, slipped through the open dormer window, and entered the sleeping loft. On the pine floorboards directly beside Brett's bed, less than 2 feet from where Brett had been sleeping beneath the wool quilts, investigators found a pair of dry spruce needles and 2 faint, muddy impressions left by the soles of heavy rubber swamp boots. The man had stood directly over Brett in the pitch darkness, watching him sleep for an undetermined amount of time before dropping the rusted iron spike on the lower floor and slipping back out through the roof window before dawn. Forensic units processing the trail camera footage and latent finger marks lifted from the glass patio door matched the prints within 12 hours to 51-year-old Curtis Dale Rader. Curtis Rader was a lifelong transient and former regional timber cutter who had lived off-grid across the deep ravines of the Weiser State Forest for over 6 years, following an outstanding bench warrant for aggravated trespassing, burglary in neighboring Schuylkill County. Rader had developed an obsessive territorial fixation on the private hunting parcel, having used the decommissioned log cabin as an unmonitored winter shelter during the 2 years the property sat vacant on the market prior to Brett's purchase. When Brett moved in, cleared the brush, installed modern deadbolts, and mounted high-definition trail cameras, Rader viewed the new owner as an illegal squatter invading his private winter territory. Instead of moving deeper into the state forest, Rader used his intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain to evade the trail cameras, mapping the property until he found the unguarded loft dormer on the roofline. A coordinated 60-man sweep involving state police tactical teams, tracking hounds, and a thermal imaging-equipped helicopter swept through the rugged hollows of Carbon County over the following 3 days. On the afternoon of the 27th of November, 2021, tracking dogs located Rader hiding inside a subterranean stone root cellar beneath the collapsed ruins of a 19th-century logging camp nearly 5 miles deep in the state forest. Rader was taken into custody without incident, found in possession of several stolen trail camera memory cards, an unlisted shortwave receiver, and 2 additional iron railway spikes tucked inside his canvas coat. Curtis Rader was indicted in Carbon County Court of Common Pleas on multiple felony charges, including first-degree burglary, criminal trespass, stalking, and harassment. In mid-2022, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 to 30 years in state correctional custody. Brett Lawson never spent another night inside the log cabin. He hired a local property liquidator to retrieve his remaining tools and furniture under police escort, and listed the 8-acre parcel on the market the very next week at a significant financial loss, selling it to a regional timber holding firm within 20 days. Brett moved back to the well-lit, populated suburbs outside Philadelphia, permanently giving up solo backcountry hunting, firmly convinced that the most dangerous predators lurking in the dark mountain timber are never the animals you set out to track. In early October of 2021, a 31-year-old freelance software developer named Caleb Miller decided he needed to escape the relentless noise and fast pace of downtown Denver. Caleb spent most of his days staring at lines of computer code, managing remote database migrations for corporate clients, and dealing with the overwhelming congestion of urban life. When a major tech firm offered him a long-term remote consulting contract that guaranteed financial stability for at least 2 years, he immediately began searching for a secluded place where he could work in absolute peace, surrounded by nature and free from distractions. After weeks of searching online real estate listings, he stumbled upon a rental property that seemed almost too good to be true. It was a solitary, 2-story wood frame home located on the rugged outskirts of Bozeman, Montana, tucked away down a steep, unpaved logging trail nearly 3 miles off Highway 191. The house was completely surrounded by thick groves of quaking aspen and towering ponderosa pine trees, sitting on a private 2-acre lot that backed directly against a dense, unpopulated stretch of federal forest land. The nearest human neighbor was more than a mile away through the trees. The house itself had a rustic, cabin-like aesthetic, featuring a broad front porch, a stone fireplace in the main living area, a compact kitchen, and a narrow wooden staircase ascending to the upper floor. Upstairs, there was a spacious primary bedroom, a small guest room that Caleb quickly converted into his home office, a bathroom, and a narrow wooden ceiling hatch with a coiled pull string that led up to an unfinished attic crawlspace. The property had sat vacant for nearly 14 months following the passing of its previous owner, an elderly recluse who had lived there alone for decades. The monthly rent was unusually low for the square footage, a detail the out-of-state property management firm attributed to the remote location and the harsh winter conditions typical of the region. Caleb signed a 12-month lease on October 14th, loaded his personal belongings and high-end computer equipment into a rented moving truck, and drove north into the Rocky Mountains. For the first few weeks, the house felt like an absolute dream come true. The air smelled crisp and clean, filled with the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. Caleb loved the profound silence that descended upon the property once the sun dipped below the jagged mountain peaks. He spent his days coding by the living room window, watching wild turkeys forage in the clearing, and enjoying the total autonomy of living completely on his own terms. By mid-November, however, the brutal Montana winter began to set in. Temperatures dropped below freezing overnight, fierce winds howled down from the mountain passes, and heavy blankets of snow coated the roof shingles and blocked the gravel access road. Because Caleb worked irregular hours, often staying awake until 3 or 4 in the morning to coordinate with international clients, his internal clock shifted entirely to the nocturnal schedule. He became deeply accustomed to the natural groans and thermal pops of a timber frame house reacting to sub-zero temperatures. When you live alone in a remote cabin during a blizzard, your mind naturally rationalizes every unexpected creak or pop as settling wood, shifting snow loads, or small field mice scurrying through the exterior insulation. The first genuine anomaly occurred during the final week of November 2021. Caleb woke up around 10 in the morning, walked down the stairs to brew his morning coffee, and noticed a small, blue ceramic mug sitting neatly on the edge of the kitchen counter. Caleb stared at the mug for a long moment, feeling a strange flicker of confusion. He was meticulous about keeping his kitchen counters completely bare, and he distinctly remembered washing all his dishes the night before and placing them inside the upper cabinet. He tried to rationalize it away, convincing himself that he must have sleepwalked into the kitchen in a state of exhaustion, pulled the mug out, and forgotten about it entirely. He washed it again, put it back in the cupboard, and pushed the incident out of his mind. A few days later, another minor discrepancy surfaced. Caleb kept a small wooden catch-all tray beside the front door where he dropped his truck, keys, wallet, and spare house key every time he returned from a grocery run into Bozeman. One evening, as he prepared to drive into town to pick up supplies, the spare house key was missing from the tray. He searched his jacket pockets, checked between the cushions of the living room sofa, and looked across his office desk, but the key was completely gone. Assuming he had dropped it in the deep snow outside while bringing in firewood, he decided to look for it later when the snow melted, dismissing it as simple clumsiness. As December rolled into January 2022, these subtle anomalies began to change from misplaced items to strange, recurring environmental shifts. On multiple occasions, while working late at his desk, Caleb would catch a faint, lingering odor drifting through the second-floor hallway. It was not the smell of wood smoke or forest rot. It was the distinct scent of cheap, mint-flavored chewing tobacco combined with the sharp, stale odor of unwashed wool. Caleb did not smoke, nor did he ever purchase tobacco products. Whenever he stood up to investigate the hallway, the smell would vanish within a couple of minutes, leaving behind only the standard scent of old plaster and dust. He told himself that perhaps the draft from the stone fireplace flue was pulling old residue down from the chimney stack, or that an animal had dragged nesting material into the exterior wall vents. Then, the auditory disturbances began in earnest. It was a frigid night in early February 2022, around 2:30 in the morning. A howling blizzard was raging outside, slamming dense sheets of snow against the glass windows. Caleb had his noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck as he compiled a complex software build on his workstation. In the sudden quiet between wind gusts, he heard 3 distinct, heavy thuds directly above his head. The sounds were dull, heavy, and spaced precisely 1 second apart, sounding unmistakably like the heel of a heavy work boot stepping down against bare plywood flooring. Caleb froze instantly, his hands hovering over his mechanical keyboard. His eyes locked onto the white drywall of the ceiling directly above his desk. He held his breath, straining his ears to listen for nearly 10 minutes, but the sound did not repeat. He eventually convinced himself that a large branch from one of the heavy ponderosa pines had snapped under the weight of the ice and struck the roofline. Even so, the deep sense of absolute security he had initially felt in the cabin began to evaporate. An oppressive, uneasy sensation of being watched settled over him, especially when he walked down the dark second-floor hallway at night or stood by the kitchen sink looking out into the pitch-black tree line. He started double deadbolting the front door every evening and began leaving the hallway overhead lights switched on throughout the entire night. By March, the winter frost began to loosen its grip, turning the snow into heavy, muddy slush and making the logging trail nearly impassable for a few weeks. Yet, despite the changing season, the missing items grew more frequent and specific. A half-empty jar of peanut butter disappeared from the pantry, only for Caleb to find the empty plastic container sitting upright in the outdoor trash bin 3 days later, even though he had not walked outside in sub-zero weather. A fleece blanket he kept folded over the living room armchair vanished entirely for a week, then suddenly reappeared neatly draped across the foot of his bed while he was out running errands. Caleb began to seriously question his own psychological stability. He wondered if the extreme isolation, combined with relentless 60-hour work weeks under artificial light, was causing him to experience dissociative memory lapses or severe sleepwalking episodes. He even began keeping a small digital voice recorder on his nightstand, hoping to capture proof of whether he was getting out of bed in his sleep. The breaking point arrived on the stormy night of the 18th of April, 2022. A heavy spring rainstorm had moved across the Gallatin Valley, bringing heavy lightning and sustained winds that knocked out the power lines to the remote property around 10 in the evening. Caleb lit several wax candles, placed them around the kitchen and living room, and sat at his desk working on a battery-powered laptop until exhaustion finally caught up with him around midnight. He shut down his electronics, walked down the dark hallway, and fell asleep quickly in his bedroom. At approximately 3:15 in the morning, Caleb was violently jolted awake by a sharp, metallic ping, followed immediately by the slow, agonizing squeak of old metal springs stretching under tension. He sat upright in bed in total darkness, his heart pounding against his ribs like a sledgehammer. The sound had come from the hallway, just a few feet outside his bedroom door. Caleb stayed completely motionless beneath the covers, straining his ears against the sound of rain drumming on the roof. For several long seconds, there was dead silence. Then he heard the faint, unmistakably deliberate sound of bare feet shuffling across the wooden floorboards of the hallway, moving slowly away from his door and toward the center of the upper floor. Caleb quietly slid his hand down to the floor beside his bed, wrapping his fingers around a heavy metal Maglite flashlight he kept for emergencies. He slipped out from under the covers with extreme caution, taking care not to let the mattress springs make a sound. He crept toward the open bedroom doorway, his breathing shallow, every nerve ending firing with adrenaline. He peered out into the dark hallway. The dim, flickering glow of distant lightning through the end-of-hall window revealed that the corridor was empty. But as Caleb raised his eyes upward, his blood ran completely cold. The rectangular attic access hatch in the ceiling, which had remained firmly closed and painted shut with layers of old white latex since the day he moved in, was hanging wide open. The wooden fold-down ladder was fully extended, its bottom rungs resting firmly on the hallway floorboards. A wave of cold, stagnant air drifted down from the dark opening above, carrying with it that exact same distinct, sickly sweet scent of cheap tobacco and unwashed wool that Caleb had smelled weeks earlier. Caleb stepped forward slowly, raising the heavy metal flashlight in his left hand. He aimed the beam up into the square void of the ceiling. The bright light cut through a thick cloud of swirling dust motes, illuminating rough-sawn timber rafters, thick layers of gray fiberglass insulation, and a narrow plywood walkway extending deep into the dark crawlspace toward the far eaves of the house. He placed his right foot onto the bottom rung of the wooden ladder. The old timber gave a quiet, ominous creak under his weight. He took a deep breath, pulled himself upward step by step, and pushed his upper body through the ceiling opening, sweeping the flashlight beam across the cavernous, dark attic. What Caleb saw tucked away in the far corner of the roofline, far beneath the sloping wooden eaves, made his breath catch instantly in his throat. There, neatly arranged in the shadows, was a fully organized, improvised living space. An old, threadbare mattress lay flat over layers of cardboard, covered by Caleb's missing fleece blanket. Beside the mattress sat a small battery-powered camping lantern glowing a faint amber. Several empty water jugs, a small pile of opened canned goods, a pair of worn work boots caked in dried mud, and a thick stack of spiral notebook pages filled from top to bottom with tight, erratic handwriting. Caleb slowly swung the flashlight beam to the left. Hanging from the wooden roof rafters directly above the mattress, suspended by thin strands of fishing line, was a large collection of printed photographs. Caleb stepped fully onto the attic plywood flooring, moving the light closer to inspect the images as the horror of the reality began to sink into his mind. Every single photograph had been captured from inside the house over the past 6 months. There were close-up shots of Caleb sitting at his computer desk with his back turned, taken through the narrow, cracked opening of his office door. There were pictures of Caleb asleep in his bed, photographed from the foot of the mattress while the room was pitch black. There were wide shots of the kitchen and living room, captured from high angles directly above the ceiling vents. And sitting right beside the stack of handwritten notes on the floor was a small ceramic dish containing a set of keys, including the missing spare key to the front door. Caleb stood completely paralyzed in the beam of his own flashlight, realizing with absolute terror that he had never been alone in the house for a single moment. Someone had been living directly above him for half a year, watching his daily routine, sliding down into his living space in the dead of night, and studying his every movement. As Caleb stood there, staring at the photographs in disbelief, a faint, metallic sound broke the silence from the floor below him. Downstairs, in the kitchen, directly beneath the attic walkway, the distinct click of the refrigerator door swinging open echoed up through the floorboards, followed immediately by the slow, heavy tread of footsteps heading toward the bottom of the staircase. The heavy footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase, the old pine treads groaning in slow, agonizing succession under the weight of someone ascending toward the second floor. Caleb did not hesitate. Pure, animal panic overrode his disbelief. He knew that if he tried to climb back down the ladder, he would run directly into the intruder on the second-floor landing with nowhere to run. Instead, Caleb clicked off the flashlight, plunging the attic into pitch blackness. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling silently across the plywood boards toward the furthest, darkest crevice under the eaves, concealing himself behind a cluster of exposed fiberglass insulation bats. He gripped the heavy metal barrel of the maglite with both hands, tucked his knees against his chest, and forced his breath to remain completely silent. Below, the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, pausing on the second-floor hardwood. A moment later, the bottom rung of the fold-down ladder creaked under sudden downward pressure. Someone had just gripped it. Through the narrow gap between the attic floor joists, Caleb saw the dim, yellowish glow of a smartphone flashlight begin to illuminate the open ceiling hatch. Then, a head and shoulders emerged into the attic crawlspace. In the pale backlighting, Caleb could see the silhouette of a tall, gaunt man in his early 40s, wearing a faded plaid coat, dirt-streaked jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. The man climbed completely into the attic, reached down to his right, and effortlessly pulled the folding ladder upward, latching the hatch closed from the inside to seal off the opening. The man turned around, took 2 steps toward his makeshift mattress, and reached out to click on his amber camping lantern. As the dim yellow light filled the space, the man suddenly froze. His eyes swept across the mattress, locking onto the disturbed stack of notebook pages, the slightly shifted photographs dangling from the fishing line, and the fresh footprints pressed into the layer of attic dust across the plywood. The man did not call out. He did not ask who was there. He simply reached behind his lower back and pulled a heavy 8-inch fixed-blade hunting knife from a leather belt sheath, his head turning methodically toward the dark shadows under the eaves where Caleb was hidden. Caleb did not wait for the blade to come closer. With a roar fueled by pure survival instinct, Caleb lunged out from behind the insulation, swinging the heavy metal maglite with all the force in his body. The metal casing connected solidly with the side of the man's jaw, knocking him sideways onto the cardboard mattress and sending the knife skittering across the floorboards into the dark. Caleb did not stay to fight. He scrambled over the fallen man, slammed his palm against the attic hatch release mechanism, and kicked the folding ladder down with his boots. He hurled himself down the ladder, tumbled onto the second-floor hallway floor, bolted down the main staircase, and tore open the front door into the pouring rain. He did not look back. He ran barefoot down the muddy 2-mile gravel trail in the pitch black until he reached the paved highway, flagging down an early morning delivery truck whose driver immediately dialed 911. Within 20 minutes, multiple Gallatin County Sheriff Patrol vehicles sped up the private road, surrounding the isolated property with tactical lights and weapons drawn. When deputies entered the home and secured the attic, the man was gone, having escaped through a small, exterior louvered vent in the attic gable. However, bloodhounds picked up his scent trail in the muddy forest behind the house, cornering 44-year-old Thomas Rayburn, hiding inside a hollowed-out drainage culvert a mile into the federal forest. When detectives processed the attic and ran Rayburn through state databases, the horrifying reality of what had taken place came into full view. Thomas Rayburn was the estranged adult son of the elderly recluse who had owned the house before passing away in 2020. Rayburn had never left the property after his father died. When the bank foreclosed on the estate and put it up for rent, Rayburn had simply constructed a concealed habitat in the deep crawl spaces of the attic, living there rent-free while the house sat empty on the market. When Caleb moved in during the fall of 2021, Rayburn decided not to leave. Instead, he treated the new tenant as a bizarre, ongoing experiment in human surveillance. The spiral notebooks recovered from the attic contained over 600 pages of daily log entries, detailing Caleb's exact schedule down to the minute. When Caleb woke up, when he put on his noise-canceling headphones, what foods he purchased from the grocery store, and the precise times of night when Caleb was in his deepest stages of REM sleep. Rayburn had used the hollow cavity behind the hallway linen closet and a small access panel behind the pantry to slip silently into the living space every single night, harvesting food, taking photos of Caleb sleeping, and stealing small personal items just to see if the young programmer would notice. Caleb broke his lease that very afternoon, had his computer equipment collected under sheriff escort, and permanently relocated back to a high-rise apartment in Denver. He installed a comprehensive digital security system on every door and window, having learned firsthand that sometimes the quietest places in the world hide the most terrifying monsters. In late November of 2020, a 35-year-old freelance video editor and digital media consultant named Liam Bennett was living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Duluth, Minnesota. Liam was an expert in high-definition video compression, optical artifact analysis, and color grading workflows. He made his living cleaning up camera footage for commercial production studios, local television networks, and regional law firms handling complex motor vehicle litigation. Because of his line of work, Liam had a methodical eye for small visual details. He was used to spending 10 to 12 hours a day seated in front of a pair of high-resolution calibrated reference monitors, scrubbing through video frames one by one, adjusting contrast curves, and catching tiny background anomalies that normal viewers would never notice. On the afternoon of the 1st of December 2020, Liam received an unexpected visit from his longtime high school friend, a 36-year-old county investigator named Deputy Travis Miller from the St. Louis County Sheriff Office. Travis looked thoroughly exhausted, carrying dark circles under his eyes and clutching a secured external solid-state hard drive inside a padded anti-static case. 3 weeks prior, on the freezing night of the 8th of November 2020, a baffling incident had occurred along a desolate stretch of Old North Shore Road, an unlit, two-lane rural blacktop winding along the rocky shoreline of Lake Superior. At approximately 11:45 that night, a 38-year-old high school physics teacher named Owen Vance was driving his 2018 Subaru Outback home from a late-night faculty planning meeting in Two Harbors. Owen was a quiet, reliable family man with zero history of mental health struggles, substance abuse, or reckless behavior. According to the official police incident report, Owen's vehicle had suddenly veered off the road at 50 miles per hour, smashed through a wooden guardrail, and plunged 30 feet down a jagged granite embankment, coming to rest against a cluster of frozen boulders just 20 feet from the icy waters of the lake. When volunteer firefighters and state troopers reached the wreckage 40 minutes later, the scene defied all logic. The Subaru was severely crushed along its front end, both front airbags had deployed, and the engine block was smashed backward into the firewall. Yet, the driver's side door was swung wide open. Owen Vance was nowhere to be found. There was no blood on the deployed airbags, no shattered glass on the driver's seat, and no footprints leading through the thin layer of fresh snow covering the granite boulders or the surrounding boreal forest. Owen had vanished entirely from the crash site without leaving a single physical trace. The only tangible piece of evidence recovered from the vehicle was a high-end, commercial-grade, dual-lens dash cam mounted behind the rearview mirror. The camera was equipped with an internal emergency capacitor designed to save the final 30 seconds of stabilized footage upon experiencing a severe collision impact. The St. Louis County investigative team and state collision reconstruction experts had reviewed the 30-second video clip hundreds of times over 3 continuous weeks. To the investigators, the dashcam footage appeared completely ordinary right up until the violent impact. The video simply showed Owen driving along the dark, deserted road through heavy fog, his headlights illuminating the empty asphalt and the tall birch trees lining the shoulders. Suddenly, at the 24-second mark, Owen's vehicle made an abrupt, violent 90-degree jerk to the right, crashing through the guardrail into the ravine. The official law enforcement consensus concluded that Owen had likely suffered a sudden medical emergency, experienced microsleep at the wheel, or swerved to avoid a deer that darted outside the camera narrow focal cone. The subsequent disappearance was tentatively categorized as a disoriented accident victim staggering into the freezing waters of Lake Superior and being swept away by the brutal undertow. The county search was officially scaled back on November 28th, but Travis could not shake the feeling that something fundamental was being overlooked. He asked Liam to run the raw, uncompressed video file through his professional forensic software to see if modern dynamic range enhancement could pull any additional clarity out of the dark, foggy night. Liam agreed to help. He loaded the raw video file onto his editing workstation, calibrated his color grading monitor to maximize shadow details in the 0 to 10% luminance range, and set the playback to loop at 1/4 speed. The footage began at timecode 11:44 and 30 seconds. The wide-angle lens showed the long, empty stretch of Old North Shore Road. The weather was miserable. Dense, swirling patches of freezing lake fog drifted across the asphalt, partially obscuring the yellow center line. The speedometer readout embedded in the lower corner of the screen showed Owen was traveling at a steady 51 miles per hour. Liam watched the forward-facing camera feed carefully. At second 10, 11, 12, the road was completely vacant. No oncoming headlights, no wildlife along the tree line, and no obstructions on the pavement. At second 23, the vehicle entered a sharp, unlit curve bordered by thick spruce trees. Then, at second 24, the Subaru violently jerked to the right, the front end smashing through the heavy wooden guardrail with a shower of splintered timber, followed by the violent, tumbling descent down the granite embankment before the video cut out upon impact against the rocks. Liam rubbed his chin, looking closely at the forward feed. Just as the police had concluded, the road directly in front of the vehicle appeared completely empty. However, Liam noticed that this specific dashcam model was a dual-channel unit, meaning it recorded both the front windshield view and the interior cabin view on synchronized split-screen channels. Liam switched the primary monitor display to focus entirely on the interior cabin camera, which utilized infrared illuminators to capture the inside of the car in the dark. The cabin footage showed Owen Vance sitting behind the steering wheel, wearing a heavy wool coat, his hands resting comfortably at the 10 and 2 positions. He looked alert, his eyes scanning the foggy road ahead through the windshield. There were no signs of drowsiness, no drooping eyelids, and no sudden slumping of the torso that would indicate a seizure or a heart attack. At second 22, 2 seconds before the crash, Owen's eyes suddenly shifted upward, locking on to the central rearview mirror mounted just beneath the camera lens. His expression transformed in a fraction of a second from calm concentration to sheer, paralyzing horror. His jaw dropped, his pupils dilated wide in the infrared light, and his shoulders locked rigid against the back of the driver's seat. Then, instead of braking or swerving normally, Owen intentionally and violently ripped the steering wheel to the right with all his strength, deliberately driving the vehicle off the road and over the cliff. Liam froze the frame at second 23, his pulse quickening. Owen had not lost control. He had not fallen asleep. Owen had looked into the rearview mirror, seen something terrifying inside or behind his car, and intentionally crashed his own vehicle through the guardrail to escape it. Liam immediately focused on the tiny, dark portion of the frame, showing the rear passenger seats through the interior cabin view. The rear cabin of the Subaru was shrouded in deep, heavy shadows, barely illuminated by the faint red glow of the dashboard instrument cluster. To the naked eye, the back seat appeared completely empty, showing only the headrests and the dark fabric of the rear bench. Liam opened a specialized spectral pixel isolation tool, pushing the shadow exposure by 5 full stops, lifting the black levels, and applying an edge detection filter to isolate contours in the dark. As the digital noise cleared from the enhanced frame, Liam felt a cold, suffocating wave of dread wash over him. Resting in the center of the rear passenger bench, positioned directly between the 2 front seats, just inches behind Owen's headrest, was the distinct, pale outline of a human figure. The figure had been lying flat across the rear floorboards beneath a dark tarp, slowly rising upward into the frame between seconds 20 and 22. The figure was wearing a tight, blackened neoprene diving hood that obscured the hair and ears, and 2 wide, unblinking human eyes were staring directly over Owen's right shoulder into the rearview mirror. And wrapped around the figure's right hand, raised just inches from Owen's neck, was a heavy, braided steel wire garrote pulled tight between 2 wooden dowel handles. Liam sat entirely paralyzed in his studio chair, staring at the frozen screen in disbelief. The St. Louis County investigators had missed the detail because they had focused entirely on the road ahead through the windshield, never enhancing the extreme low-light shadows of the rear cabin in the 2 seconds prior to the crash. Liam dragged the timeline forward past the crash impact to the final 3 seconds of the video, where the vehicle had come to rest against the frozen boulders of the lake. The front windshield was cracked and shattered, but the cabin camera remained functional on its backup battery capacitor. In the final 2 seconds of the recording, as the vehicle lay tilted sideways against the rocks, the driver's side door was kicked open from the inside. Owen Vance stumbled out onto the rocks, battered and disoriented, and following directly behind him, crawling out of the driver's side door with terrifying speed and agility, was the dark, hooded figure from the back seat, landing on the granite boulders in complete silence. The hooded figure reached out, grabbed Owen by the collar of his heavy coat, and dragged the injured teacher backward into the dense, pitch-black spruce forest bordering the water just as the camera battery finally died. Liam grabbed his phone with trembling hands, dialing Deputy Travis Miller's private cell number. Travis answered on the second ring, his voice sounding tired. "Liam, did you find anything on the forward road file?" Liam took a slow, deep breath, his eyes fixed on the frozen frame on his monitor. "Travis, get the sheriff and a tactical unit back out to the crash site on Old North Shore Road right now." Travis paused on the other end. "Why? What did you find?" Liam leaned into his phone, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Owen didn't crash because of the road, Travis. There was someone in the back seat with a garrote. And when the car hit the rocks, that person dragged Owen alive into the woods." Deputy Travis Miller did not waste a single second. Within 3 minutes of Liam's phone call, the entire St. Louis County Sheriff Office was placed on tactical alert, and an urgent multi-agency manhunt was launched across the desolate North Shore corridor. By 9 o'clock that evening, 4 unmarked tactical response units, state police tracking teams, and 2 high-intensity K-9 search units arrived at the rugged granite shoreline off Old North Shore Road. Floodlights turned the pitch-black spruce forest into stark daytime, cutting through the swirling coastal fog. The bloodhounds picked up a faint, distinct scent trail beginning exactly where the dashcam footage showed Owen being dragged into the trees. The trail did not lead toward the frigid open waters of Lake Superior, as previous search teams had assumed. Instead, it pushed deep into the rugged interior of the boreal forest, navigating an unmapped labyrinth of granite ridges and dense spruce thickets for nearly 2 miles. At approximately 11:15 at night, the K-9 handlers halted their dogs at the base of an old, overgrown rock embankment. Tucked into the side of the limestone ridge was an abandoned, reinforced concrete pump house that had once served a decommissioned iron ore rail spur in the 1970s. The rusted steel security door hung slightly ajar, secured only by a loose length of heavy galvanized chain. Tactical deputies moved forward in formation, breached the heavy iron door with a hydraulic spreader, and swept the subterranean concrete interior with weapon lights blazing. Lying in the far corner of the damp concrete room, bound with heavy nylon cord and suffering from severe hypothermia, but conscious and miraculously alive, was Owen Vance. Beside him, attempting to escape through a narrow rear drainage shaft leading into the woods, tactical officers tackled and restrained a 39-year-old man named Bradley Holt. When investigators processed Holt's background, vehicle telemetry, and personal history over the following 48 hours, the horrifyingly calculated nature of the abduction was fully exposed. Bradley Holt was a former independent logistics contractor who had lost his business after Owen Vance, acting as a regional physics consultant and forensic accident analyst for a corporate insurance review 2 years earlier, testified in a civil fraud trial that proved Holt had deliberately staged commercial transport crashes for insurance payouts. Holt had spent 24 months tracking Owen's daily schedule, memorizing his routes along the isolated North Shore corridor, and planning an act of private retaliation. On the night of November 8th, while Owen was inside the high school attending the late-night faculty meeting, Holt slipped into the school parking lot, picked the lock on the Subaru rear tailgate, and crawled beneath a black cargo tarp on the rear floorboards, waiting patiently for over 2 hours in the freezing cold until Owen got behind the wheel. Holt's plan had been to garrote Owen from behind along the deserted stretch of Old North Shore Road, steer the car into the deep lake waters to make the incident look like a tragic drowning accident, and escape into the night. He never anticipated that Owen would catch the sudden movement in his rearview mirror 2 seconds before the strike, recognize the lethal threat, and make the desperate, split-second decision to intentionally crash the vehicle into the guardrail to save his own life. Bradley Holt was formally indicted in Minnesota District Court on charges of attempted first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and felony assault with a deadly weapon. In late 2021, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Oak Park Heights without the possibility of parole. Owen Vance made a full physical recovery, returning to his teaching career after months of rehabilitation. The St. Louis County Sheriff Office formally updated its forensic video review protocols to mandate advanced infrared shadow enhancement on all multi-channel dashcam files, serving as a permanent institutional reminder that the most critical clue in a life-or-death mystery is sometimes hidden in the pitch-black shadows where nobody thinks to look. In early September of 2021, a 34-year-old museum conservator named Darren Kelly purchased a property that felt like the realization of a lifelong dream. Darren had spent more than a decade working in Boston, living in small, overpriced brick apartments where space was at an absolute premium. His specialty was the physical restoration of antique furniture and historical woodwork, a craft that required dedicated square footage, excellent natural lighting, and total quiet. After saving diligently for years, Darren began searching throughout the historic towns of New England for an older home with authentic colonial architecture that had not been butchered by modern open-concept renovations. He found a listing for an expansive, two-story saltbox colonial home located on the wooded outskirts of Greenfield, Massachusetts. The house had originally been erected in 1788, sitting quietly at the end of an unpaved lane off Silver Street, surrounded by 3 acres of dense sugar maples and ancient stone walls. It had remained in the possession of a single reclusive family for over 4 generations before finally being transferred to a bank trust following the death of its last elderly occupant in late 2019. Because the property required significant cosmetic work, including plaster restoration, rewiring, and extensive carpentry repairs, the purchase price was exceptionally reasonable. Darren closed on the sale on September 18th, loaded his specialized woodshop tools, clamps, and personal belongings into a 20-foot box truck and made the drive west into Franklin County. During the first few weeks of autumn, the Greenfield house seemed ideal. The ground floor featured wide plank pumpkin pine floors, heavy hand-hewn ceiling beams, 2 massive central brick fireplaces, a formal parlor, a dining room, and an expansive rear addition that Darren immediately claimed as his primary furniture conservation workshop. The upper level contained 2 large corner bedrooms, a single bathroom fitted with vintage plumbing, and an open landing that looked down over the front foyer. The house was cold, smelling intensely of dry lath plaster, old beeswax, and centuries of wood ash trapped deep within the masonry flues. But for Darren, those scents were the natural hallmarks of historical timber framing. Whenever the autumn wind off the Deerfield River rattled, the antique 6/6 window sashes or the floor joists popped during sudden evening temperature drops, he simply noted the structural settling as normal character traits of an 18th century structure. However, as November of 2021 arrived and the temperatures plummeted into the low 20s, Darren began to notice a peculiar spatial discrepancy that nagged at his professional architectural instincts. Because of his background in historic preservation, Darren had an exceptional eye for structural dimensions, load-bearing proportions, and spatial symmetry. While taking detailed laser tape measurements on the ground floor to construct custom wooden shelving for his workshop tools, he measured the total length of the exterior north-facing foundation wall from the outside, which measured exactly 46 feet. Yet, when he went inside the house and measured the interior length of the back parlor and his adjoining workshop along that very same north wall, the combined interior measurement totaled only 34 feet. Even after accounting for the massive central chimney stack, double-thick lath and plaster walls, and exterior timber framing, there was an unaccounted void of approximately 12 linear feet along the rear spine of the ground floor. At first, Darren assumed that the space was merely a dead architectural cavity created during a 19th century addition, perhaps an abandoned pantry shaft or a sealed chimney support pier. But the more he looked at the layout of the back parlor, the less sense the exterior window placement made. From the outside of the house, looking at the rear facade, there were three identical double-hung windows spaced evenly across the lower level. Inside the house, however, there were only two windows visible, one in the parlor and one in his workshop. The middle window, visible clearly from the overgrown backyard garden, did not open into any room on the ground floor. It was completely obscured from the interior by a solid wall of heavy, floor-to-ceiling dark pine wainscoting paneling that ran along the east side of the fireplace. On the evening of the 24th of November 2021, the night before Thanksgiving, a heavy, freezing rainstorm rolled across western Massachusetts, trapping Darren inside the house with the wood stove burning hot. Armed with a pry bar, a heavy rubber mallet, a carpenter level, and a high-intensity work light, Darren decided to investigate the dead space behind the paneling once and for all. He set up the work light in the back parlor, illuminating the dark pine boards that lined the chimney alcove. He ran his fingers along the joints of the vertical planks, searching for the telltale head of modern drywall screws or antique cut nails. As his hand brushed against the lower right section of the center raised panel, roughly 2 inches above the baseboard molding, he felt a subtle, spring-loaded give in the wood. Darren knelt down on the pine floorboards, shining his light directly into the fine vertical seam between the panels. There, concealed within a recessed groove in the wood, was a small, hand-forged iron latch mechanism, completely unpainted and virtually invisible to anyone not actively searching for a seam. Darren placed the tip of his flathead screwdriver into the latch channel and applied firm upward pressure. With a dull, dry snap that echoed through the quiet house, the internal iron catch disengaged. A 6-foot-tall section of the solid pine wainscoting swung outward by 2 inches, revealing a concealed door frame set flush into the framing timbers. The air that poured through the freshly opened seam was shockingly frigid, thick with the heavy, sweet scent of ancient lime dust, dry cedar shavings, and cold, damp wool that had remained sealed away from sunlight for decades. Darren stood up slowly, gripping the heavy rubber mallet in his right hand and switching on a high-powered tactical LED flashlight with his left. He pulled the concealed pine panel completely open on its hidden iron pintle hinges. The beam of his flashlight cut through a dense curtain of undisturbed cobwebs, illuminating a narrow, rectangular secret room that measured roughly 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, positioned directly between the back of the parlor wall and the exterior timber siding of the house. The room possessed a low ceiling made of exposed, rough-sawn joists, completely insulated with dense layers of horsehair and compressed newspaper clippings dating back to the late 1930s. The middle window that Darren had observed from the exterior was indeed located in the center of the outer wall, but the interior side of the glass had been thoroughly blacked out using heavy coats of dark oil-based enamel paint, preventing any light from leaking out into the yard. Darren stepped across the wooden threshold, his boots crunching loudly over a thin layer of dry plaster chips that had flaked away from the framing. The room was not empty. It was entirely, meticulously furnished as a private, self-contained living compartment. Against the far back wall sat a single, narrow iron cot fitted with an old horsehair mattress, neatly made with a faded patchwork quilt and 2 rough wool blankets. Beside the bed rested a low wooden nightstand crafted from unfinished pine boards. Sitting atop the nightstand was an unlit kerosene lamp with an intact glass chimney, a half-empty box of wooden strike-anywhere matches, a pair of wire-rimmed reading spectacles, and an open ceramic shaving mug containing a dried boar bristle brush. Darren approached the cot slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs in the dead silence of the hidden room. He moved the beam of the flashlight toward the center of the chamber, where a small wooden writing desk sat positioned against the interior wall. Resting on the surface of the desk was an old mechanical portable typewriter with a blank sheet of discolored rag paper rolled halfway around the rubber platen. Beside the typewriter sat a small stack of leather-bound personal journals, bound with thick twine. Darren stepped up to the desk, set the rubber mallet down on the floorboards, and pulled his clean cotton work gloves from his pocket to handle the delicate historical artifacts. He gently lifted the top journal from the stack, carefully untying the faded twine. He opened the front cover. Written across the inside page in sharp black fountain pen ink was a single name, accompanied by a series of precise date ranges extending from the 12th of October, 1974, all the way through the 3rd of March 2018. Darren turned the brittle pages, scanning the entries. The writing was not a collection of personal memoirs or historical family reflections. It was an exhaustive, daily observational log tracking the movements of the house's primary occupants over 44 continuous years. The journal detailed exact waking times, meal preparations, daily arguments, financial discussions, and medical routines of the previous elderly family members who had owned the house, recorded in clinical, emotionless detail. Darren felt a cold wave of nausea rise in the back of his throat. He looked down at the entry dated the 3rd of March 2018, the day the final elderly occupant of the house had suffered a fatal medical emergency in the front parlor. The entry read, "The ambulance has arrived at the front gate. The paramedics are loading the stretcher. The house is now clear. I will remain inside the framing until the estate settles." Darren stood frozen, his eyes scanning the final lines of the page. The bank had taken possession of the house in late 2019, and the house had supposedly sat vacant until Darren moved in 2 months ago in September of 2021. Darren slowly closed the journal and reached for the second notebook beneath it on the stack. This notebook was entirely different. It was a modern, plastic-covered spiral notebook, completely fresh and devoid of age-related discoloration. Darren flipped open the front cover. Across the first page, written in fresh blue ballpoint ink, was the date, the 18th of September, 2021, the exact date Darren had moved into the property. The journal continued with hundreds of daily log entries running up to the present week. September 22nd. The new owner is a woodworker. He sleeps in the northwest bedroom. He drinks coffee at 6:15 in the morning. He works until 11 at night. October 14th. He is measuring the parlor floorboards. He is getting closer to the chimney stack. November 24th. He has brought a hammer and a pry bar into the parlor at 9 in the evening. Darren dropped the notebook onto the desk as if it had burned his skin. He spun around in the narrow space, his flashlight beam trembling violently as he shone the light across the hidden chamber. There, resting directly at the foot of the iron cot, which he had initially mistaken for an old roll of canvas, was a pair of modern, fleece-lined winter slippers, completely clean and lightly damp from fresh perspiration. Beside the slippers sat a small, battery-operated digital audio baby monitor receiver plugged into a hidden extension cord behind the wainscoting, actively picking up the loud, heavy sound of Darren's own breathing echoing back through the speaker. And from directly above the ceiling joists of the secret room, in the pitch-black crawlspace tucked between the ground floor ceiling and the second-floor subfloor, Darren heard the faint, distinct sound of a floorboard shifting under slow, deliberate human weight, followed by the quiet click of a metal latch being drawn back directly above his head. Darren did not pause to look up into the ceiling rafters. Pure survival reflex took command of his limbs. He threw himself backward through the open, concealed panel, tumbling onto the wide pine floorboards of the back parlor. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard the sharp splintering of dry lathwood as a rectangular ceiling trapdoor dropped open directly inside the secret room behind him, sending a heavy cloud of gray horsehair insulation swirling into the beam of his work lamp. Darren grabbed the edge of the heavy wainscoting panel, slammed it shut into its frame, and shoved the heavy oak timber workbench across the floorboards, wedging its massive 100-pound frame tight against the hidden seam. From inside the wall came a series of violent, heavy impacts as someone threw their body weight against the pine paneling, rattling the framing timbers of the chimney breast. Darren did not wait for the wood to give way. He bolted across the parlor, tore through the front hallway, snatched his phone and truck keys from the entry table, and burst through the front door into the freezing rain. He jumped into his pickup truck, locked the cab doors, threw the transmission into reverse, and backed down the unpaved lane at breakneck speed until he reached the paved road, immediately dialing 911. Within 15 minutes, 4 cruisers from the Greenfield Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police sped down Silver Street, their blue and red emergency strobes cutting through the sheets of cold rain. 6 armed officers breached the front entrance of the colonial house with service weapons drawn, clearing the parlor, workshop, and upper bedrooms before systematically breaching the sealed void behind the chimney. When officers forced back the heavy wainscoting and secured the secret room, the space was empty, but the ceiling hatch remained hanging wide. Tactical officers climbed into the ceiling void, following a reinforced plywood crawlway that ran between the floor joists of the entire house, directly connecting the secret chamber to the unfinished attic and down into an old exterior bulkhead beneath the rear porch. A perimeter search team with K-9 units quickly tracked fresh footprints in the muddy garden soil behind the property, discovering an elderly, emaciated man hiding inside a dry drainage culvert beneath the stone wall at the edge of the woods, shivering in soaked clothing. When detectives processed the fingerprints and medical records of the 71-year-old man, the full, incomprehensible history of the Greenfield Saltbox House came into terrifying focus. The man was identified as Arthur Sterling, the youngest son of the original patriarch who had owned the house in the mid-20th century. Arthur had been officially reported missing and presumed dead by Massachusetts authorities in the winter of 1974. Following what family members had claimed was a catastrophic drowning accident in the Deerfield River during an ice storm. In reality, Arthur had never left the property. Following a severe psychological breakdown in his early 20s, the deeply insular patriarchal family had constructed the concealed chamber behind the central fireplace wainscoting, hiding Arthur away from the public, social services, and the law. For 44 consecutive years, while his siblings and parents grew old, managed the estate, and eventually died off one by one, Arthur had lived as an invisible inhabitant within the hollow cavities of the house. He moved through the crawl spaces in total silence, descending into the kitchen in the dead of night to gather leftover food, observing the passage of decades entirely through small peepholes cut into the lath and plaster behind wall clocks and vintage mirrors. When the last living family member suffered a fatal heart attack in the parlor in 2018, Arthur simply retreated into the structural framing, continuing his subterranean existence while the house sat bank-owned and vacant for nearly 2 years, surviving on stockpiled non-perishable goods and water collected from an old gravity-fed cistern in the basement. When Darren Kelly purchased the property in the fall of 2021, Arthur did not see the new owner as an intruder to attack, but as a new subject to catalog and observe. He had adapted to Darren's woodworking schedule, listening to every phone call through the floorboards, tracking every step Darren took with the laser tape measure, and retreating into the upper ceiling cavity whenever Darren worked too close to the hidden panel. Arthur Sterling was taken into protective medical custody and transferred to a state psychiatric care facility in Worcester, where he was provided with intensive psychological treatment after spending nearly half a century sealed away from the outside world. Darren Kelly spent the following 3 days packing his tools and conservation equipment into a moving trailer under private security supervision. He broke his purchase agreement through legal arbitration on grounds of non-disclosed structural habitation, returned to the Boston area, and permanently shifted his furniture restoration business into modern, open commercial studios, never again setting foot inside a historical home without checking every square inch behind the walls.